Welcome, seeker of shadows, to the cursed waters where death becomes merely a doorway and redemption remains forever beyond reach. Tonight we shall explore the complete chronicle of Solomon Grundy, the shambling monument to humanity's capacity for both corruption and tragedy, whose story begins not in the supernatural realm of resurrection but in the all-too-human world of poverty, abuse, and choices that echo through eternity. Let the gentle rhythm of decay and rebirth carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace the path from man to monster, from Cyrus Gold to the creature born on Monday, who would die and rise again countless times in his eternal search for something his damned soul could never reclaim. In the sprawling industrial heart of 19th century Gotham City, where the promise of American prosperity drew countless souls seeking transformation from their humble origins into something greater, there began a tale that would ultimately demonstrate how the pursuit of betterment could become the architect of one's own damnation. The story of the man who would become Solomon Grundy does not begin with supernatural forces or cosmic accidents, but rather with the most ordinary of human aspirations corrupted by circumstances that would plant seeds of darkness in soil already fertile for tragedy. The Gold family's arrival in Gotham City represented everything that defined the American dream in its most innocent incarnation, a vision of honest labor rewarded with steady prosperity, of dedication leading inevitably to advancement, of a better life waiting for those willing to work for it with their hands and their hearts. Gold Sr. had possessed the kind of optimism that characterized so many immigrants and migrants who looked toward the great cities of the industrial age as temples where effort would be transformed into opportunity, where the limitations of rural life could be transcended through application of will and muscle to the great machinery of progress. The decision to change his family name to Gold was more than simple vanity or pretension, though it contained elements of both these human weaknesses. It represented a conscious attempt to reshape identity itself, to cast off whatever associations his original name might have carried, and embrace a designation that spoke directly to his ultimate aspirations and deepest values. Gold was wealth made manifest, the substance that men killed for and died pursuing, the universal symbol of success that transcended cultural boundaries and social distinctions. To take such a name was to declare one's intentions to the universe, to announce that mediocrity would not be accepted and that destiny itself could be rewritten through sufficient determination. Yet the cruel irony that would define the Gold family's experience in Gotham City was already embedded within this choice, for in seeking to align themselves with fortune through nomenclature, they had inadvertently highlighted their distance from the very prosperity they sought to claim. The name Gold became not a talisman of success, but a constant reminder of everything they lacked, a daily mockery that followed them through the narrow streets and cramped tenements, where the city's working poor struggled to maintain dignity in the face of systematic exploitation and casual cruelty. The docks where Gold Sr. found employment were a world unto themselves, a realm where the normal rules of civilized society were suspended in favor of more primitive arrangements that favored strength over justice, cunning over honor, and ruthlessness over compassion. Here, in the shadow of great ships that carried the wealth of nations, men labored in conditions that would have been familiar to slaves and serfs throughout history, their bodies treated as expendable machinery whose value was measured solely by their capacity to move cargo from one location to another without asking uncomfortable questions about wages or working conditions. The systematic theft that characterized Gold Sr.'s employment was not conducted through dramatic robberies or obvious criminal enterprise. but rather through the kind of methodical extraction that capitalism at its most predatory had perfected into an art form. Workers were charged for tools that should have been provided, docked pay for damage that resulted from inadequate equipment, forced to purchase necessities at company stores where prices were inflated beyond any reasonable measure, and subjected to 1,000 small deceptions that ensured their labor would enrich their employers while leaving them perpetually trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. The physical demands of dock work would have been challenging enough under fair conditions, but when combined with the psychological pressure of knowing that one's efforts were being systematically undermined and exploited, they became a form of torture that ground down not only the body, but the spirit. Gold Senior's hands became gnarled and scarred from handling rough cargo without proper protection. His back bent from lifting loads that should have required mechanical assistance. His lungs filled with dust and chemical fumes that would shorten his life and compromise his health in ways that would only become apparent years after the damage had been done. The transformation from hopeful immigrant to broken laborer was neither sudden nor complete, but rather a gradual erosion of optimism and self-respect that occurred so slowly that Gold Senior himself was not fully aware of how profoundly he was being changed by his circumstances. The man who had once believed that hard work would be rewarded began to understand that the system was designed to prevent such rewards from reaching those who generated the wealth through their labor. The father who had dreamed of providing his family with opportunities he had never enjoyed found himself unable to even secure basic necessities without constant struggle and compromise. Yet perhaps the most devastating aspect of Gold Senior's situation was not the physical hardship or financial deprivation he endured, but rather the way these external pressures began to corrupt his character and poison his relationships with the people he loved most. The rage that had no appropriate target at work found expression at home, where his wife and son became convenient repositories for frustrations that had been building throughout days spent being humiliated and exploited by employers who viewed him as less than human. The domestic violence that characterized the Gold household was not born from inherent cruelty or sadistic pleasure in causing pain, but rather from the terrible mathematics of powerlessness, seeking outlet through the victimization of those even more vulnerable than oneself. Gold Senior's abuse of his family represented a desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of control and authority in a life where he had been systematically stripped of both. Yet this understandable psychological response only served to multiply the suffering that his exploitation had created, while destroying the very relationships that might have provided him with comfort and support during his darkest moments. The beatings that young Cyrus endured were not random explosions of violence, but carefully orchestrated rituals of humiliation designed to teach specific lessons about power, weakness, and the proper relationship between those who commanded and those who obeyed. Each blow was accompanied by philosophical instruction about the nature of the world and the futility of expecting justice or fairness from a universe that rewarded strength and punished vulnerability. The child was being systematically educated in the principles that would later guide his own approach to interpersonal relationships and social interaction. The most horrifying aspect of Cyrus's childhood trauma was not the physical abuse he suffered, though that was severe enough to leave permanent scars on both his body and his psyche, but rather the elaborate psychological torment that his father devised as a method of ensuring that the lessons being taught would never be forgotten or ignored. The annual ritual of being buried alive on his birthday represented a form of cruelty so calculated and symbolic that it transcended mere violence to become a kind of perverted sacrament, a ceremony designed to inscribe certain truths about worthlessness and mortality into the deepest levels of the child's developing consciousness. Each year, as young Cyrus was forced to lie motionless in the cold earth while dirt was shoveled onto his small body, he experienced a form of death that was both literal and metaphorical, a preview of the grave that awaited all human beings, while also serving as a brutal reminder of his own insignificance in his father's eyes. The weight of the soil pressing down upon his chest made breathing difficult and movement impossible, creating a claustrophobic environment where panic and despair could flourish, while rational thought was suppressed by primal terror and the overwhelming need to survive until the ordeal ended. The psychological impact of these ritualized burials extended far beyond the immediate trauma of the experience itself to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of existence and the value of human life that would shape Cyrus's worldview for the remainder of his natural existence. If his own father, the person who should have loved and protected him above all others, could treat him with such callous disregard for his suffering and dignity, then what hope was there that the wider world would offer him anything resembling compassion or justice? The message that these ceremonies were designed to communicate was brutally simple, yet profoundly destructive. That Cyrus was worth less than the dirt that covered him, that his life had no inherent value that others were obligated to respect, and that survival would depend entirely upon his ability to become stronger and more ruthless than those who sought to exploit or destroy him. These lessons were being carved into his consciousness through experiences so intense and traumatic that they would never be forgotten or overcome through any amount of subsequent positive experience. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of Cyrus's childhood was not the abuse he suffered, but the gradual erosion of his capacity for trust, empathy, and genuine human connection that resulted from years of systematic betrayal by the person who should have been his primary source of security and unconditional love. The child who had been born with the normal human capacity for forming healthy relationships was being systematically trained to view all interpersonal interactions through the lens of power, dynamics, to see every gesture of affection as potential manipulation, and to understand that vulnerability was a luxury he could never afford. The presence of his mother during these years served as both a source of hope and an additional source of trauma, for her inability or unwillingness to protect her son from his father's cruelty taught Cyrus that even those who claimed to love him would ultimately prioritize their own safety and comfort over his well-being. Her silent witness to his suffering, her failure to intervene or even acknowledge what was being done to him, became another form of abandonment that reinforced the lessons his father was teaching about the fundamental selfishness of human nature and the futility of expecting rescue from external sources. The day when Cyrus's mother finally gathered her belongings and fled the household represented both liberation and catastrophe, freeing her son from the daily reminder of what maternal love could look like, while simultaneously confirming his worst fears about abandonment and betrayal. Her kiss goodbye was both tender and terrible, a gesture of affection that came too late to heal the damage that had already been done, while also serving as a final demonstration that even the strongest bonds could be severed when circumstances became sufficiently difficult. The conversation that preceded her departure, if it can be called a conversation given the power imbalance between adult and child, revealed the terrible pragmatism that poverty and abuse had forced upon her character. She explained that she was leaving not because she did not love him, but because staying would mean her own destruction, and that she hoped he would understand when he was older that sometimes love required making choices that appeared selfish from the outside, but were actually necessary for survival. Yet for young Cyrus, these sophisticated moral calculations meant nothing compared to the simple reality that the person who should have protected him was choosing to abandon him to face his father's wrath alone. The adult understanding that his mother's departure might actually improve his chances of survival by removing one target of his father's rage was beyond his emotional comprehension, overwhelmed by the more immediate recognition that he was now truly isolated in a world that had already proven itself hostile to his existence and indifferent to his suffering. The aftermath of his mother's departure saw an escalation in Gold Sr.'s treatment of his son that reflected both the loss of his primary target for abuse and his own growing desperation as his circumstances continued to deteriorate. Despite years of backbreaking labor and systematic exploitation, the man who had once believed that dedication and perseverance would eventually be rewarded had begun to understand that the system was designed to prevent such rewards from reaching people like him, yet rather than directing his rage toward those responsible for his exploitation, he focused it even more intensely on the child who represented everything he had failed to achieve and protect. The visit to the docks that would result in Gold Sr.'s death began as yet another attempt to teach his son about the harsh realities of adult existence and the futility of expecting life to provide anything resembling fairness or justice. Young Cyrus was brought to witness firsthand the conditions under which his father labored, to see the casual cruelty and systematic exploitation that characterized the relationship between workers and their employers, and to understand that this was the fate that awaited him unless he found ways to transcend the circumstances of his birth. The accident that claimed Gold Sr.'s life was both random and inevitable, the predictable result of safety conditions that prioritized profit over human welfare, while also representing the kind of cosmic irony that seemed to define the Gold family's relationship with fortune. The container that broke free from its moorings and crushed him had been inadequately secured due to cost-cutting measures that valued efficiency over worker protection, yet its timing seemed almost deliberately calculated to occur at the moment when his son was present to witness the ultimate futility of his life's work. The sound of his father's body being crushed beneath tons of cargo was something that would echo through Cyrus's memory for the remainder of his existence. A wet crunch that spoke to the fundamental fragility of human flesh. When confronted with the mechanical forces that drove industrial civilization. Yet even more traumatic than the death itself was the reaction of the dock supervisor, whose laughter and casual disposal of the corpse demonstrated that Gold Sr.'s life had been valued at exactly nothing by those who had profited from his labor. The image of his father's broken body being kicked into the waters beneath the pier like discarded refuse would become one of the defining memories of Cyrus's childhood, a moment that crystallized everything he had learned about the relationship between power and powerlessness, while also providing him with a vision of the fate that awaited those who accepted their circumstances rather than fighting to change them. The casual cruelty of the supervisor's actions spoke to a worldview that saw workers as expendable resources, rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Yet in the depths of his grief and rage, young Cyrus made a decision that would shape the remainder of his existence and ultimately lead to his transformation into something far more terrible than the circumstances that had created him. Standing over the waters where his father's body had disappeared, he vowed that he would never accept the kind of powerlessness that had defined Gold Sr.'s existence, that he would never allow himself to be ground down by forces beyond his control, and that he would create his own power through whatever means proved necessary. This vow was not made with full understanding of its implications, or consideration of the moral costs that would be involved in its fulfillment. For Cyrus was still a child whose capacity for complex ethical reasoning had been systematically undermined by years of trauma and abuse. He knew only that the conventional path of honest labor and patient endurance had led his father to a meaningless death and his family to destruction, and that alternative approaches must be sought if he were to avoid a similar fate. The encounter with Pearl, that occurred shortly after his father's death, represented one of the last opportunities for Cyrus to choose a different path, to allow human connection and compassion to provide him with alternatives to the vengeance and power-seeking that were already beginning to dominate his thoughts. Pearl's discovery of him wounded and bleeding in Dugan's alley, her spontaneous prayer for his protection and healing, her offer of comfort and companionship, all represented the possibility that love and faith might provide resources for overcoming the trauma and rage that threatened to consume him. Yet Cyrus's rejection of Pearl's offered friendship was not merely a rejection of individual kindness, but a repudiation of the entire worldview that her gesture represented. Her belief in divine providence and the power of prayer struck him as naive fantasy, the kind of comforting delusion that prevented people from recognizing the harsh realities of existence and taking the decisive action necessary to protect themselves from exploitation and abuse. If there were a God who cared about human suffering, then surely such a being would have intervened to prevent the systematic torture that had defined his childhood, or the meaningless death that had claimed his father. The philosophical framework that Cyrus was developing during these formative experiences was both logical and catastrophic, based on accurate observations about the nature of power and exploitation, while drawing conclusions that would ultimately lead him toward choices that multiplied, rather than reduced the amount of suffering in the world. His understanding that conventional morality was a luxury that the powerless could not afford was astute, yet his solution of embracing immorality as a source of strength represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between power and happiness. The mysterious stranger who approached Cyrus during his moment of greatest vulnerability and despair was not a random encounter, but rather the inevitable result of the young man's psychological and spiritual condition, making him an inevitable, ideal target for the kind of supernatural predation that thrived on human weakness and moral confusion. The offer of wealth and power in exchange for lifetime service was presented not as a Faustian bargain, but as a practical business arrangement, a mutually beneficial contract between entities who understood the true nature of existence and were willing to work within its constraints rather than being limited by sentimental notions about right and wrong. The handshake that sealed Cyrus Gold's fate was not forced upon him through deception or supernatural compulsion, but rather accepted willingly by someone who had been systematically prepared by his life experiences to view such an arrangement as not only acceptable, but desirable. Years of trauma and abuse had taught him that power was the only reliable source of security, that conventional morality was a trap that kept the weak subservient to the strong, and that survival required embracing whatever methods proved effective regardless of their impact on others. The transformation that began with this supernatural pact was both immediate and gradual, providing Cyrus with access to resources and opportunities that had been beyond his reach, while also beginning a process of spiritual corruption that would ultimately cost him everything that had once made him recognizably human. The wealth and influence that flowed to him were real and substantial, enabling him to transcend the poverty and powerlessness that had defined his early life. Yet they came with psychological and moral costs that would not become fully apparent until it was far too late to reconsider the choices that had made them possible. The supernatural covenant that Cyrus Gold had entered into with forces beyond mortal comprehension did not manifest its benefits through dramatic displays of otherworldly power or obvious violations of natural law, but rather through a subtle realignment of circumstance and opportunity that made his ascent to wealth and influence appear to be the natural result of superior intelligence and ruthless determination. The entity that had offered him this bargain understood that the most effective forms of corruption were those that allowed their subjects, to maintain the illusion that their success was entirely self-generated, that their moral compromises were practical necessities rather than spiritual surrenders. The first manifestation of this dark providence came through information that reached Cyrus's ears at precisely the right moments. Whispered rumors about business opportunities and criminal vulnerabilities that others had missed or ignored. He learned which shipments would be inadequately guarded, which warehouses contained valuable goods with minimal security, which corrupt officials could be approached with bribes, and which honest ones could be eliminated or discredited through carefully orchestrated scandals. This knowledge came to him not through supernatural revelation, but through seemingly natural channels that made it appear his success was due to exceptional networking and investigative skills. The initial crimes that Cyrus committed to accumulate his starting capital were carefully selected, not merely for their financial potential, but for their symbolic significance in his personal journey from victim to victimizer. The men who had tormented him during his childhood years of poverty and vulnerability became his first targets, their exploitation and murder serving both practical and psychological functions that fed the growing darkness within his soul. Each act of revenge provided him with both material resources and emotional satisfaction, creating a feedback loop that made violence increasingly attractive as a solution to every problem he encountered. The systematic nature of Cyrus's campaign against his childhood tormentors revealed both the calculating intelligence that made him dangerous and the profound psychological damage that made him irredeemable. He did not simply kill these men in fits of rage or passion, but rather studied their habits and weaknesses with scientific precision, learning their schedules and vulnerabilities before striking at moments when they were most isolated and defenseless. The cruelty he had suffered as a child was returned with compound interest, yet the satisfaction these murders provided was temporary and hollow, requiring increasingly extreme acts to produce the same emotional relief. The wealth that Cyrus extracted from his victims was not merely stolen but systematically laundered through legitimate business ventures that allowed him to establish a respectable public persona while conducting his real operations in the purses, shadows. He purchased properties that had been owned by men he murdered, assumed control of criminal enterprises that had previously excluded him, and gradually built a network of associates who respected his ruthlessness while remaining ignorant of the supernatural forces that had made his rise possible. The criminal empire that emerged from these early successes operated according to principles that reflected both Cyrus's understanding of power dynamics and his complete abandonment of the moral constraints that governed normal human behavior. His organization was structured like a predatory ecosystem, with himself at the apex and various levels of subordinates below him, who maintained their positions through combinations of fear, greed, and mutual dependence. Those who served him faithfully were rewarded with wealth and protection, while those who disappointed him simply disappeared without explanation or trace. The methods that Cyrus employed to maintain discipline within his organization were legendary for their creativity and cruelty, designed not merely to punish specific infractions, but to create an atmosphere of terror that prevented others from even considering betrayal or disobedience. He understood that fear was more effective than affection as a motivating force, that people would do things to avoid pain that they would never do to obtain pleasure, and that the occasional dramatic example of what happened to those who crossed him was worth more than any amount of positive incentives. The legitimate businesses that Cyrus established as fronts for his criminal activities were run with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized his illegal operations, though they served additional purposes beyond simple money laundering and reputation management. These enterprises provided him with opportunities to study and eventually corrupt respected members of Gotham's business community, drawing them into compromising situations that made them dependent upon his continued goodwill, while also expanding his network of influence throughout the city's power structures. The corruption of public officials that Cyrus orchestrated was perhaps his greatest achievement in terms of long-term strategic planning, for it provided him with protection from law enforcement, while also giving him access to information and resources that would have been impossible to obtain through purely criminal means. He understood that judges, politicians, and police commanders were human beings with weaknesses and desires like anyone else, and that the right combination of bribes, threats, and blackmail could transform even the most principled individuals into willing collaborators in his criminal enterprises. The psychological transformation that occurred within Cyrus during this period of rapid ascent was as profound as the external changes in his circumstances, though it proceeded so gradually that he himself was not fully aware of how completely he was abandoning everything that had once made him recognizably human. The young man who had once been capable of accepting Pearl's friendship and considering the possibility of divine providence was being systematically replaced by something that viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of basic consideration and respect. The most tragic aspect of Cyrus's moral deterioration was not the cruelty he inflicted upon strangers and enemies, but rather the way his success poisoned his relationships with the few people who had shown him genuine affection and loyalty during his years of powerlessness and suffering. The supernatural forces that had enabled his rise to prominence did not distinguish between those who had harmed him and those who had helped him, viewing all human connections as potential weaknesses that needed to be severed if their investment in his corruption was to achieve its full potential. The murder of his own mother represented the completion of his transformation from victim to monster, the final abandonment of any pretense that his actions were motivated by justice rather than simple sadism and the pursuit of power for its own sake. The woman who had abandoned him during his childhood had indeed failed him when he needed her protection most. Yet her killing served no practical purpose, beyond satisfying his desire for revenge and demonstrating to himself that he had transcended all normal human limitations and obligations. The method by which Cyrus killed his mother was chosen for its symbolic rather than practical significance, reflecting his understanding that certain acts had power beyond their immediate effects to reshape the fundamental nature of the person who committed them. He did not simply shoot or stab her, but rather forced her to confront the consequences of her abandonment through extended psychological torture, before finally ending her life in ways that paralleled the emotional death he had experienced when she chose to flee rather than protect him from his father's abuse. The disposal of her body in the waters of Slaughter Swamp was not merely a practical decision designed to prevent discovery by law enforcement, but rather a ritualistic act that connected his personal crimes to the broader pattern of violence and corruption that had been accumulating in that cursed location for generations. The swamp had already become a repository for the victims of Gotham's criminal underworld, a place where bodies disappeared and secrets were buried beneath layers of mud and decay that made investigation impossible and justice unlikely. The psychological satisfaction that Cyrus derived from his mother's murder was both intense and temporary, providing him with a sense of completion and closure that had been absent from his previous acts of revenge, while also revealing the fundamental emptiness that lay at the heart of his approach to existence. The elimination of the person who had caused him the deepest childhood trauma should have healed the wounds that had driven him toward violence and criminality, yet instead it simply created new forms of hunger that required even more extreme acts to satisfy. The establishment of his marriage to Pearl represented both the pinnacle of his earthly success and the beginning of his ultimate downfall, for it connected him to someone who remembered the person he had been before his transformation. while also providing him with new opportunities to explore the depths of cruelty that his supernatural patron had made possible. Pearl's love for him was genuine and deep, based on memories of the wounded child she had tried to comfort. Yet this very authenticity made her presence both precious and unbearable to someone who had systematically eliminated every trace of vulnerability and compassion from his own character. The children that Cyrus and Pearl produced together represented the last possibility for redemption that existed within his increasingly corrupted existence, offering him opportunities to break the cycle of abuse and violence that had defined his own childhood, while also serving as living reminders of the innocence and hope that he had chosen to abandon in pursuit of power and revenge. Their births should have awakened whatever remained of his capacity for love and protection, yet instead they became additional targets for the cruelty that had consumed his soul and transformed him into something that could no longer be considered genuinely human. The gradual revelation of Cyrus's true nature to Pearl and their children occurred not through dramatic confrontations or sudden discoveries, but rather through the accumulation of small cruelties and casual acts of violence that made it impossible to maintain the pretense that he remained the man she had married. His drinking, his verbal abuse, his prolonged absences from home, all served to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that poisoned the domestic happiness they had briefly achieved, while also preparing them psychologically for the greater horrors that were to come. The domestic violence that characterized the later years of Cyrus's marriage was not merely a continuation of the patterns he had learned during his own childhood, but rather a conscious choice to inflict upon others the same forms of suffering that had shaped his character, while also serving as a method of maintaining psychological distance from emotions and connections that threatened to interfere with his criminal activities. The man who had once been capable of loving Pearl discovered that love itself had become a weakness that his supernatural patron would not permit him to retain. The escalating pattern of abuse that defined Cyrus's relationship with his family followed predictable trajectories that reflected both his understanding of psychological manipulation and his complete abandonment of the protective instincts that should have governed his interactions with those who depended upon him for safety and support. He used his knowledge of their individual fears and vulnerabilities to maximize the impact of his cruelty, while also ensuring that they remained too terrified and isolated to seek help from external sources that might have provided them with alternatives to continued victimization. The murder of Pearl represented not merely the elimination of a witness to his crimes or the removal of an obstacle to his criminal activities, but rather the final severing of his connection to the possibility of genuine human relationship and moral redemption. Her death was both inevitable given the trajectory of his moral development and unnecessary in any practical sense, serving no purpose beyond satisfying his need to demonstrate absolute power over those who had once possessed the ability to inspire love and tenderness within his increasingly corrupted heart. The manner of Pearl's death was chosen to parallel the symbolic significance of his mother's murder, while also serving as a grotesque inversion of the baptismal imagery that had characterized their courtship and early marriage. The woman who had once offered him spiritual salvation through prayer and faith was drowned in the same waters where he had disposed of his mother's corpse, her death serving as both practical elimination and ritualistic sacrifice to the dark forces that had enabled his rise to power, while demanding ever greater moral compromises as payment for their continued support. The aftermath of Pearl's murder saw Cyrus achieving the complete isolation and spiritual desolation that had been the inevitable result of his supernatural bargain, leaving him surrounded by wealth and power, yet utterly alone, in ways that no amount of criminal success could alleviate or compensate. The man who had sought to transcend the powerlessness of his childhood through the accumulation of material resources and social influence discovered that these achievements were meaningless without the human connections that gave them context and purpose. The community uprising that eventually formed against Cyrus's reign of terror was not the result of law enforcement investigation or coordinated resistance by his criminal rivals, but rather the spontaneous expression of collective outrage by ordinary citizens who had been victimized by his organization and could no longer tolerate the climate of fear and violence that his presence had created throughout their neighborhoods. These were not professional criminals or political revolutionaries, but rather shopkeepers, laborers, and family members who had reached the point where even the risk of confronting him seemed preferable to continued passive acceptance of his predations. The composition of the mob that pursued Cyrus to Slaughter Swamp revealed the true scope of his crimes and the breadth of suffering he had caused throughout Gotham's working-class communities. Among his pursuers were the children of men he had murdered, the widows of victims whose bodies had never been found, the business owners he had extorted and terrorized, and the parents of young people who had been corrupted or destroyed through their involvement with his criminal organization. Their anger was not merely personal but collective, representing the accumulated grief and rage of an entire community that had been systematically victimized by someone who had chosen evil as his path to power. The chase through Gotham's streets and eventually into the wetlands beyond the city limits took on qualities of ritualistic purification as the representatives of everything decent and human sought to cleanse their community of the monstrous presence that had poisoned it through years of unchecked criminality and systematic cruelty. Yet even in this moment of apparent justice, the supernatural forces that had enabled Cyrus's crimes were already preparing the final phase of their investment in his corruption, ensuring that his death would not bring the closure and healing that his victims so desperately sought and deserved. The decision to take his own life rather than face capture and possible redemption through confession or punishment represented the ultimate expression of the pride and spiritual bankruptcy that had driven all of Cyrus's choices since his acceptance of the dark bargain that had transformed him from victim to victimizer. Even in his final moments, he chose control over surrender, damnation over the possibility of grace, ensuring that his story would not end with human justice or divine mercy, but rather with the continuation of evil through supernatural means that would make his human crimes seem almost trivial by comparison. The blade that pierced his heart as he sank beneath the cursed waters of Slaughter Swamp was both an instrument of suicide and a ritual implement that completed the transformation that had begun with his handshake with forces beyond mortal comprehension. The man who had sought to transcend human limitation through the embrace of evil achieved his goal in ways he could never have anticipated, becoming something that was no longer bound by the constraints of mortality, yet had lost everything that had once made existence meaningful or worthwhile. The years that followed Cyrus Gold's ascension to wealth and criminal prominence were marked by a gradual but inexorable transformation that mirrored the corruption of his father, while exceeding it in both scope and systematic cruelty, demonstrating how the cycles of abuse and violence could perpetuate themselves across generations, while growing more sophisticated and devastating with each iteration. The man who had sworn never to become like Gold Sr. found himself embracing behaviors and attitudes that not only replicated his father's failures, but amplified them through the application of superior resources and more refined understanding of psychological manipulation and control. The domestic paradise that Cyrus and Pearl had briefly achieved during the early years of their marriage served as both a testament to what might have been possible if different choices had been made, and a tragic illustration of how even the most genuine love could be systematically destroyed by someone whose soul had been corrupted beyond the reach of normal human emotion. The home they established together was furnished with luxuries that neither of them could have imagined during their impoverished childhoods. Yet these material comforts became increasingly meaningless as the psychological atmosphere within their household grew more toxic and threatening with each passing season. The children who were born into this environment of escalating tension and hidden violence were innocent victims of circumstances that they could neither understand nor escape, trapped between their natural love for the father, who should have protected them, and their growing awareness that he had become something dangerous and unpredictable, whose presence filled their daily lives with anxiety and fear. Their early years were marked by confusion, as they attempted to reconcile the man who sometimes showed them affection and generosity with the increasingly frequent displays of rage and cruelty that characterized his interactions with their mother and with the world beyond their home. The pattern of Cyrus's moral deterioration followed trajectories that were both predictable and tragic, as the supernatural forces that had enabled his rise to power began to extract payment through the systematic erosion of everything that had once made his existence meaningful and worthwhile. The love he had felt for Pearl became first possessiveness, then resentment, and finally active hatred, as her continued goodness served as a constant reminder of the innocence and compassion he had chosen to abandon in pursuit of wealth and influence that had proven hollow and unsatisfying despite their material abundance. The drinking that became increasingly central to Cyrus's daily routine was not merely a recreational activity or social convention, but rather a necessary anesthetic that allowed him to function while carrying the psychological burden of the crimes he had committed and the moral compromises that had made his success possible. Each glass of alcohol temporarily dulled the voice of conscience that still whispered accusations and regrets in the quiet moments when his criminal activities were not providing sufficient distraction from the growing emptiness that consumed his inner life like a spiritual cancer. The verbal abuse that Cyrus began inflicting upon Pearl and their children served multiple functions beyond simple expression of his mounting frustration and rage, operating as both a method of psychological control designed to ensure their continued submission to his authority, and a systematic program of emotional destruction intended to eliminate their capacity for independent thought or action. His words were chosen not randomly, but with calculated precision, targeting each family member's specific vulnerabilities and insecurities in ways that maximized psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability about his deliberate cruelty. The escalation from verbal to physical violence occurred gradually enough that each incident could be rationalized as an aberration rather than part of a larger pattern, allowing Cyrus to maintain the fiction that he remained fundamentally different from his father while engaging in behaviors that were actually far more systematic and devastating than the relatively crude abuse he had suffered during his own childhood. His superior intelligence and resources allowed him to inflict psychological damage that was more profound and lasting than simple physical brutality, though he would eventually embrace that as well when subtler methods proved insufficient to satisfy his growing appetite for dominance and control. The children's responses to their father's increasing volatility and unpredictability revealed the profound psychological damage that domestic violence inflicts upon developing minds, as they struggled to adapt to an environment where love and terror were inextricably intertwined, and where survival depended upon constantly monitoring an adult's emotional state to predict and avoid potential explosions of rage. Their natural childhood spontaneity and joy were gradually replaced by hypervigilance and emotional numbness, protective mechanisms that allowed them to function in their toxic home environment while robbing them of the security and freedom that should have characterized their formative years. The isolation that Cyrus systematically imposed upon his family was designed to prevent them from developing relationships or sources of support that might provide them with alternatives to continued victimization or opportunities to reveal the reality of their home life to authorities who might intervene on their behalf. He monitored their interactions with neighbors, teachers, and potential friends with the same attention to detail that he applied to his criminal enterprises, using combinations of manipulation, intimidation, and outright threats to ensure that they remained emotionally and socially dependent upon him despite his increasingly abusive treatment. Pearl's gradual transformation from the vibrant, faithful young woman who had once offered prayers for his healing into a hollow-eyed shadow of her former self represented one of Cyrus's greatest crimes, though it was committed so slowly and systematically that even she was not fully aware of how completely her spirit was being crushed beneath the weight of constant fear and psychological manipulation. The woman who had once possessed enough strength and compassion to reach out to a wounded child in an alley found herself increasingly unable to protect her own children from the monster their father was becoming. The religious faith that had once sustained Pearl through the hardships of poverty and uncertainty became both a source of torment and a target for Cyrus's particular brand of psychological cruelty, as he systematically undermined her beliefs through sophisticated theological arguments designed to demonstrate the absence of divine justice or intervention in a world where evil was consistently rewarded and innocence was routinely punished. His attacks on her faith were not casual blasphemy, but carefully orchestrated campaigns of spiritual destruction that sought to eliminate her last source of hope and resistance to his absolute authority. The community's growing awareness of the changes in Cyrus's character and the deteriorating conditions within his household created an atmosphere of whispered speculation and carefully avoided confrontation that allowed his domestic crimes to continue unchecked while also building the foundation for the eventual uprising that would drive him to his final refuge in Slaughter Swamp. Neighbors who had once respected his business success and social prominence began to cross streets to avoid encounters with him, while former associates found reasons to terminate their professional relationships rather than risk exposure to his increasingly unpredictable and dangerous behavior. The business meetings and criminal planning sessions that Cyrus conducted in his own home exposed his children to violence and corruption that no young minds should have been forced to witness, serving as both practical education in the methods of his criminal empire and psychological conditioning designed to normalize brutality and moral compromise as acceptable aspects of adult existence. These experiences planted seeds of trauma and confusion that would influence their development long after their father's death, ensuring that his corruption would continue to poison future generations, even if his direct influence was eliminated. The servants and household staff who witnessed Cyrus's treatment of his family became unwilling participants in his crimes through their silence and complicity, trapped between their economic dependence upon his continued employment and their moral revulsion at the suffering they observed daily within his home. Their testimonies would later provide crucial evidence of his domestic violence, yet during the period when their intervention might have saved lives, they remained paralyzed by fear and self-interest that made them accessories to ongoing abuse and psychological torture. The progressive deterioration of Pearl's mental and physical health under the constant stress of her husband's abuse created visible evidence of his cruelty that could not be entirely concealed from the outside world. Yet the explanations he provided for her declining condition were accepted by a community that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths about the reality of domestic violence among their social betters. Her increasing frailty and obvious terror in his presence should have triggered intervention by friends, family members, or community leaders. Yet the social conventions of the era and the economic power he wielded protected him from accountability, while leaving her increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The final confrontation between Cyrus and Pearl that would result in her death was not a spontaneous explosion of violence, but rather the culmination of years of escalating abuse and psychological warfare that had systematically destroyed her capacity for resistance or escape. The immediate trigger for his lethal rage was relatively trivial, a minor disagreement or perceived slight that would have been easily resolved between healthy individuals. Yet, in the toxic atmosphere of their relationship, it became the excuse for violence that had been building toward this inevitable conclusion throughout their marriage. The method by which Cyrus murdered his wife was chosen for its symbolic significance as much as its practical effectiveness, representing both the final destruction of the spiritual qualities that had once attracted him to her, and the ultimate expression of his complete abandonment of every human value and emotion that might have provided resistance to the supernatural forces that had been systematically corrupting his soul. The drowning that ended Pearl's life served as both murder and baptism, a grotesque inversion of the sacramental imagery that had characterized their courtship, while also serving as preparation for his own eventual death in the same cursed waters. The disposal of Pearl's body in Slaughter Swamp was conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all of Cyrus's criminal activities, yet it also represented a ritualistic offering to the dark forces that had enabled his rise to power, while demanding ever greater moral compromises as payment for their continued support. The swamp that had already claimed his mother's corpse now received his wife's remains, adding another layer to the accumulating spiritual corruption that was transforming that location into something far more dangerous than a simple repository for criminal evidence. The impact of their mother's disappearance upon Cyrus's children was both immediate and devastating, as they were forced to confront the reality that the person who had provided them with whatever love and protection they had known was gone forever, while also living with the unspoken knowledge that their father was responsible for her absence. The official explanations provided for Pearl's disappearance were transparently false, yet the children were too young and powerless to challenge them, while also being too terrified of their father to seek help from external authorities who might have provided them with protection or justice. The period following Pearl's murder saw Cyrus achieving a form of absolute domestic authority that should have satisfied his appetite for control and dominance, yet instead revealed the fundamental emptiness and meaninglessness of power, exercised purely for its own sake, rather than in service of any constructive purpose or genuine human connection. The house that had once been filled with laughter and family warmth became a mausoleum where fear and silence reigned supreme, providing him with the unchallenged authority he had sought, while also demonstrating the hollow nature of victories won through the destruction of everything that made victory worthwhile. The children's adaptation to their mother's absence and their father's increasingly erratic behavior followed patterns that reflected both their natural resilience and the profound psychological damage that prolonged exposure to domestic violence had inflicted upon their developing personalities. Some became withdrawn and compliant, seeking invisibility as protection from their father's unpredictable rages, while others began displaying aggressive behaviors that mirrored his example, creating dynamics within the household that perpetuated cycles of violence and abuse that might continue across multiple generations. The community's response to Pearl's disappearance was characterized by the same willful blindness and moral cowardice that had allowed Cyrus's domestic abuse to continue unchallenged for years, as respectable citizens chose to accept official explanations rather than confront uncomfortable truths about someone whose economic success and social prominence had made him seemingly untouchable. Their collective failure to investigate her fate or protect her children represented a form of community complicity that enabled continuing crimes while also building the moral pressure that would eventually explode in the uprising that drove him to his final confrontation with justice. The business associates and criminal partners who worked with Cyrus during this period of escalating domestic violence found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with his unpredictable behavior and obvious psychological instability, yet their own complicity in his illegal activities made them reluctant to break their associations or report his crimes to authorities who might investigate their own involvement in his criminal empire. Their growing unease and gradual withdrawal from his inner circle contributed to his increasing isolation and paranoia, creating feedback loops that accelerated his moral and psychological deterioration. The supernatural forces that had orchestrated Cyrus's rise to power and systematic corruption observed his domestic crimes with satisfaction, recognizing them as evidence that their investment in his damnation was proceeding according to plan, while also preparing for the final phase of their ultimate purpose for his existence. The murder of his wife and the terrorization of his children were not merely crimes but sacraments in a dark liturgy that was transforming him into something that would serve their purposes far more effectively than any human criminal could, no matter how successful or ruthless he might become. The final months of Cyrus Gold's human existence were marked by an acceleration of all the destructive patterns that had characterized his life since accepting the supernatural bargain that had lifted him from poverty while condemning his soul to eternal corruption. The wealth and power he had accumulated through decades of crime and violence began to feel increasingly meaningless and burdensome, providing him with no genuine satisfaction or sense of accomplishment, while requiring ever greater efforts to maintain and protect against the growing number of enemies who sought his destruction for both personal and altruistic reasons. The isolation that had once seemed like strength began to reveal itself as profound weakness, as Cyrus found himself surrounded by subordinates who feared him but felt no loyalty, business partners who collaborated with him purely from self-interest, and family members who remained in his presence only because they lacked alternatives, rather than from any genuine affection or respect. The empire he had built through systematic brutality and moral compromise was revealed to be a hollow shell that could provide him with material comfort and social authority, while leaving him spiritually bankrupt and emotionally desolate in ways that no amount of worldly success could remedy or disguise. The community uprising that would eventually drive him to Slaughter Swamp began not with organized resistance or coordinated planning, but with the spontaneous expression of collective rage and moral revulsion that had been building for years among the ordinary citizens who had suffered under his predatory criminal activities and witnessed the systematic destruction of collective, everything decent and hopeful within their shared social environment. The spark that ignited this popular revolt was relatively minor, yet it served to focus years of accumulated grievances and suppressed fury into a focused demand for justice that could no longer be ignored or deflected through the political and economic influence he had cultivated among corrupt officials and business leaders. The waters of Slaughter Swamp that received Cyrus Gold's dying body were not merely another wetland ecosystem existing on the margins of Gotham City's industrial expansion, but rather a location where the natural world had been systematically corrupted by decades of human evil. transformed into something that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual realms, where normal laws of biology and chemistry were superseded by darker principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and decay. The accumulated weight of countless crimes committed within its boundaries had altered the fundamental nature of the swamp itself, creating conditions that were uniquely suited to the kind of supernatural transformation that would ultimately give birth to Solomon Grundy. The history of violence and corruption that had made Slaughter Swamp into a repository for Gotham's criminal underworld stretched back generations before Cyrus Gold's arrival, beginning with the original murders and disappearances that had given the location its ominous name, while establishing patterns of spiritual contamination that would grow more powerful and malevolent with each successive act of evil committed within its shadowy confines. The native peoples who had once inhabited the region had recognized its cursed nature and avoided it except for specific ritualistic purposes, understanding through ancestral wisdom that some locations were too dangerous for ordinary human presence or activity. The industrial development that had brought European settlers and their descendants into contact with the swamp had ignored these traditional warnings, treating indigenous beliefs as primitive superstition rather than genuine insight into forces that transcended normal scientific understanding. The factories and processing plants that were built along the swamp's edges began dumping their toxic waste into waters that were already spiritually poisoned, creating a unique combination of chemical and metaphysical corruption that would prove capable of preserving and transforming organic matter in ways that violated every known principle of biological decay and decomposition. The bodies that had been disposed of in the swamp over the years had not simply decomposed according to natural processes, but rather had become part of a vast organic matrix that preserved their essential elements while also absorbing and concentrating the spiritual residue of their violent deaths. Each murder victim contributed their own portion of unresolved rage, terror, and despair to the growing reservoir of dark energy that permeated every molecule of water and grain of sediment within the swamp's boundaries, creating conditions that were uniquely receptive to consciousness that had been similarly corrupted by violence and moral compromise. The supernatural forces that had orchestrated Cyrus Gold's rise to power and systematic corruption had always intended for his story to culminate in this particular location, understanding that only within the swamp's uniquely corrupted environment could their investment in his damnation achieve its full potential and serve their ultimate purposes. His death by suicide was not merely the end of his human existence, but rather the beginning of a transformation process that would require decades to complete, during which his consciousness would be slowly reshaped and enhanced, while his physical form was rebuilt, according to principles that transcended normal biological limitations. The chemical composition of the swamp water into which Cyrus Gold's body sank was unlike anything found in conventional aquatic environments, containing not only the industrial toxins that had been dumped there by careless manufacturers, but also exotic compounds that had been generated through the interaction of spiritual corruption with organic decay over many years of accumulated evil. These substances began immediately to penetrate his tissues and alter his cellular structure in ways that prevented normal decomposition, while also creating the conditions necessary for eventual reanimation under circumstances that would not occur for several decades. The process of physical transformation that began with Cyrus's submersion in the cursed waters was both gradual and comprehensive, affecting every aspect of his biological structure, while also preserving the essential patterns of consciousness and memory that would eventually animate his resurrected form. His bones became saturated with minerals that made them harder than steel, while maintaining enough flexibility to support movement and growth, while his muscles were slowly replaced by fibrous plant matter that could generate far greater strength than normal human tissue, while also proving virtually immune to conventional forms of damage or destruction. The preservation of his nervous system during this extended period of transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire process, as the swamp's unique properties maintained the complex electrochemical patterns that had encoded his memories, personality, and learned behaviors, while also enhancing their storage capacity and processing power through integration with the broader consciousness that permeated the corrupted ecosystem. His brain tissue was gradually replaced by a hybrid organic matrix that combined plant fibers with crystalline structures that could store and process information far more efficiently than normal neural networks. The decades that passed while Cyrus Gold's body underwent its supernatural transformation were marked by increasing levels of spiritual activity within Slaughter Swamp, as the consciousness that had once belonged to him began to integrate with the accumulated rage and despair of all the other victims whose remains had been disposed of in those cursed waters. This collective consciousness was not merely a simple combination of individual personalities, but rather a new form of awareness that transcended normal human limitations, while also being shaped by the most negative and destructive aspects of human nature. The dreams and visions that plagued the sleeping minds of Gotham City residents during this period of gestation often featured images of the swamp and its hidden secrets, though few who experienced these nocturnal terrors understood their true significance, or recognized them as glimpses of the horror that was slowly taking shape beneath the murky waters where so many bodies had been laid to rest. The psychic emanations generated by the transforming consciousness were strong enough to influence sensitive individuals across considerable distances, creating an atmosphere of unease and foreboding that affected the entire region without providing any clear indication of its supernatural source. The plant life that flourished within Slaughter Swamp during these decades of supernatural transformation was unlike anything found in conventional wetland environments, displaying characteristics that reflected the unique combination of chemical and spiritual corruption that permeated every aspect of the ecosystem. The trees grew larger and more twisted than their counterparts in normal forests, their bark taking on colors and textures that seemed to shift depending upon the observer's angle of view, while their roots extended deep into the contaminated sediment where they could draw nutrients from the decomposing remains of countless victims. The animal life that survived within the swamp's boundaries was similarly affected by the ongoing transformation process, with creatures displaying enhanced size, aggression, and intelligence that made them dangerous to any human beings who might venture into their territory. The fish that swam in the poisoned waters grew to enormous proportions while developing predatory instincts that were far more sophisticated than their species normally exhibited, while the birds that nested in the corrupted trees began displaying behaviors that suggested they were serving as scouts or sentries for some larger intelligence that observed all activities within the swamp's domain. The atmospheric conditions within Slaughter Swamp became increasingly unstable and unpredictable as the transformation process continued, with strange fogs and mists appearing without warning to obscure visibility while also carrying scents and sounds that seemed to emanate from no identifiable source. The temperature fluctuations that characterized these phenomena defied meteorological explanation, creating pockets of intense heat or bitter cold that could appear and disappear within moments, while leaving no trace of their passage except for the psychological impact they had upon any witnesses who survived encounters with them. The electromagnetic disturbances that began occurring throughout the region during the later stages of the transformation process interfered with both natural and artificial navigation systems, causing compasses to spin wildly while also disrupting radio and telephone communications in ways that made it virtually impossible for anyone who entered the swamp to summon help or maintain contact with the outside world. These effects were not random, but rather seemed to follow patterns that suggested deliberate manipulation by an intelligence that understood how to isolate and control its territory through technological as well as supernatural means. The few scientific expeditions that attempted to study the unusual conditions within Slaughter Swamp during this period met with disasters that were both inexplicable and terrifying, as researchers discovered that conventional instruments and methodologies were inadequate for measuring or understanding the forces they encountered. Equipment failures occurred with suspicious frequency, while team members reported experiencing hallucinations, memory lapses, and episodes of disorientation that made it impossible to conduct meaningful research, while also creating serious safety hazards that forced early termination of most investigative efforts. The local folklore that developed around Slaughter Swamp during these decades of supernatural activity reflected the community's growing awareness that something unprecedented and dangerous was taking shape within its boundaries, though the specific nature of the threat remained hidden behind layers of superstition and exaggeration that made it difficult to distinguish between genuine observations and imaginative embellishment. The stories told by fishermen, hunters, and other individuals who claimed to have ventured near the swamp's edges described sounds, sights, and experiences that seemed to defy rational explanation, while also displaying enough consistency to suggest that they might be based upon actual encounters with supernatural phenomena. The influence of the transforming consciousness began to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the swamp itself as the process neared completion, affecting the dreams and behavior of individuals throughout the surrounding region, while also manifesting through various forms of psychic disturbance that could not be explained through conventional psychological or medical frameworks. Children born during this period often displayed unusual sensitivity to spiritual influences, while adults who had lived in the area for many years reported changes in their own personality and emotional responses that seemed to correlate with proximity to the corrupted wetlands. The industrial facilities that continued operating along the edges of Slaughter Swamp experienced increasingly frequent equipment failures and worker injuries that could not be adequately explained through normal safety analysis or mechanical inspection. The accidents that occurred seemed to follow patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage or supernatural interference rather than random mechanical failure. Yet investigations consistently failed to identify any human agency responsible for the mounting toll of damaged machinery and injured personnel that plagued every business venture that attempted to maintain operations in the area. The final phases of Cyrus Gold's transformation into Solomon Grundy were marked by increasing levels of seismic and atmospheric disturbance that reflected the enormous energies being generated by the completion of his resurrection process, as decades of accumulated corruption and supernatural influence reached critical mass and began preparing to manifest in physical form. The ground throughout the swamp began to tremble with subsonic vibrations that could be felt for miles in every direction, while the water levels fluctuated dramatically without any corresponding changes in rainfall or seasonal patterns that might have provided natural explanations for these phenomena. The consciousness that had been slowly forming within the depths of Slaughter Swamp during these decades of transformation was no longer recognizable as simply an enhanced version of Cyrus Gold's original personality, but rather had become something entirely new and unprecedented that combined human intelligence with plant-like longevity and mineral-based durability, while also possessing access to spiritual energies that transcended normal biological limitations. This hybrid awareness retained fragments of Gold's memories and learned behaviors, yet these human elements were now embedded within a larger consciousness that operated according to principles derived from the accumulated experience of every victim whose remains had contributed to its formation. The first stirrings of physical movement within the grave that had held Cyrus Gold's transforming remains for so many years were subtle enough to be attributed to normal settling of sediment or seasonal changes in water pressure. Yet they represented the beginning of an awakening process that would soon reveal the true scope and power of what had been created through the unique combination of supernatural corruption and natural decay that characterized Slaughter Swamp's ecosystem. The hand that first broke through the surface of the muddy water was no longer entirely human in its structure or composition, displaying characteristics that reflected its hybrid nature while also possessing strength that far exceeded anything that conventional biology could produce. The emergence of Solomon Grundy from the depths of Slaughter Swamp represented not merely the resurrection of a single individual, but rather the birth of an entirely new form of consciousness that embodied the accumulated evil, spiritual corruption of generations of criminal activity, while also possessing the power to influence and reshape the world according to its own twisted understanding of justice and natural law. The creature that rose from those cursed waters carried within its massive form the memories and motivations of Cyrus Gold, yet these human elements were now part of a larger entity that operated according to supernatural principles that made it both more and less than human, in ways that would challenge every assumption about the nature of life, death, and the possibility of redemption for souls that had chosen to embrace absolute evil. The first sensation that penetrated the transformed consciousness of the being who had once been Cyrus Gold was neither sight nor sound, but rather a profound awareness of weight and substance that spoke to fundamental changes in the nature of his physical existence, as though he had awakened to discover that his body had been rebuilt from materials that operated according to entirely different principles than the flesh and bone that had characterized his previous incarnation. The dense, fibrous mass that now comprised his form possessed a solidity and permanence that transcended normal biological limitations. Yet it was animated by energies that seemed to flow from sources beyond conventional understanding of metabolism and cellular function. The darkness that surrounded him was not merely the absence of light, but rather a positive presence that seemed to welcome his awakening, while also serving as a protective barrier that shielded him from the harsh realities of the world beyond Slaughter Swamp, until he could fully adapt to his new nature and capabilities. Within this embracing shadow, he could sense the presence of other consciousnesses that had contributed to his transformation, the accumulated awareness of countless victims whose remains had been absorbed into the supernatural matrix that had served as both tomb and womb during the decades of his metamorphosis from human criminal to something far more ancient and terrible. The memories that gradually surfaced within his reconstructed mind were fragmented and distorted, like images reflected in broken mirrors that showed familiar scenes and faces from unfamiliar angles, while also revealing details that had been hidden or forgotten during his previous existence as Cyrus Gold. He could recall the taste of his mother's tears as he murdered her, the sound of Pearl's final breath as she drowned beneath his hands, the weight of his father's corpse as it was kicked into the waters that had ultimately claimed his own life. Yet these recollections seemed to belong to someone else entirely, viewed from a perspective that was simultaneously intimate and alien. The physical sensations of his new form were unlike anything that human consciousness had been designed to process or understand, as nerve endings that had been replaced by more primitive yet more durable sensory systems transmitted information about his environment, in ways that bypass traditional categories of perception, while providing him with awareness that was both more comprehensive and more selective than normal human senses could achieve. He could feel the movement of every creature within the swamp's boundaries, sense the chemical composition of the water that surrounded him, and detect the electromagnetic signatures of living beings at distances that would have been impossible for purely biological perception to encompass. The strength that flowed through his reconstructed musculature was not merely enhanced but fundamentally different in its nature and application, operating through principles that combined the hydraulic efficiency of plant stems with the leveraged power of crystalline structures, while also drawing upon energy sources that seemed to be connected to the earth itself rather than dependent upon conventional metabolic processes. His first attempts at movement revealed capabilities that far exceeded anything he had possessed as a human being, yet also demonstrated the need for careful control and conscious restraint if he were to avoid causing unintended destruction through the simple act of physical motion. The emergence from the muddy depths of Slaughter Swamp was both birth and resurrection, a process that combined elements of natural development with supernatural intervention, while also serving as a declaration that the laws governing normal existence had been transcended through the unique combination of spiritual corruption and environmental contamination that characterized his being. Place of transformation. The water that cascaded from his massive form as he rose to his full height carried with it the accumulated essence of decades spent in communion with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, marking his passage from one state of being to another through baptismal immersion in corruption rather than purification. The night air that filled his reconstructed lungs brought with it scents and information that spoke to both the familiar geography of his former human existence and the profound changes that had occurred during his long absence from the blank world of the living, as industrial expansion had altered the landscape, while also adding new layers of chemical and spiritual contamination to an environment that had already been thoroughly poisoned by human activities. The lights of Gotham City that glowed in the distance seemed both beckoning and threatening, representing civilization and order, yet also calling to mind the countless crimes and betrayals that had characterized his previous interactions with human society. The first living creatures that encountered the newly awakened Solomon Grundy were the various animals that had adapted to life within Slaughter Swamp's corrupted ecosystem, their reactions ranging from instinctive terror to curious investigation, as they attempted to categorize a being whose nature defied their evolved understanding of predator and prey relationships. The smaller creatures fled immediately upon sensing his presence, while the larger and more aggressive inhabitants of the swamp approached with caution that reflected their recognition of something unprecedented and potentially dangerous in their midst. The trees and plant life that surrounded his emergence site seemed to respond to his presence with a form of recognition that transcended normal botanical behavior, their branches swaying without wind, while their roots shifted beneath the surface of the water, in patterns that suggested communication or acknowledgement of kinship, with a being who shared their plant-based composition while also possessing capabilities that they could only dimly comprehend. This vegetative response to his awakening provided Solomon Grundy with his first indication that his transformation had created connections to the natural world that operated according to principles entirely foreign to human experience. The fragmented memories of language that remained within his altered consciousness were jumbled and incomplete, requiring conscious effort to organize into patterns that could serve as tools for thought and communication, rather than simply random collections of sounds and symbols that carried emotional associations without clear semantic content. The process of relearning speech was complicated by physical changes to his vocal apparatus that made normal human articulation difficult, while also opening possibilities for forms of expression that transcended conventional linguistic limitations through the incorporation of subsonic frequencies and harmonic resonances that could convey meaning through direct neural stimulation. The discovery of clothing and equipment left behind by previous visitors to the swamp provided Solomon Grundy with both practical necessities and disturbing reminders of the human world that he had once inhabited, as he struggled to adapt garments designed for normal human proportions to his enlarged and altered form, while also grappling with fragmentary memories of social customs and behavioral expectations that seemed simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign to his current nature and circumstances. The boots and coat that he eventually managed to secure offered protection from environmental hazards, while also serving as tangible connections to the civilization that had created and then abandoned him. The first attempts at coherent self-identification revealed the profound changes that had occurred within his consciousness during the decades of transformation. As the name Cyrus Gold felt alien and inappropriate for a being whose nature had been so fundamentally altered through supernatural processes, while the identity of Solomon Grundy seemed to emerge spontaneously from sources that transcended his individual memories to draw upon collective cultural knowledge that had somehow been absorbed during his long communion with the corrupted ecosystem of the swamp. The nursery rhyme that provided this new identity carried associations and implications that operated on multiple levels of meaning, connecting him to cycles of death and resurrection, while also suggesting patterns of behavior and existence that would govern his future interactions with the world. The violent encounters that marked Solomon Grundy's first interactions with human beings who ventured into his swamp domain were not motivated by malice or conscious cruelty, but rather emerged from a combination of confusion, instinctive territorial behavior, and fragmentary memories of violence that had been so central to his previous existence as Cyrus Gold that they had become embedded within his transformed consciousness as fundamental behavioral patterns that operated below the level of rational thought or moral consideration. The criminals who had chosen the swamp as a hiding place discovered that their sanctuary had become the lair of something far more dangerous than any law enforcement agency they might have been fleeing. The methodical nature of these early killings revealed both the retention of human intelligence within Solomon Grundy's altered consciousness and the profound changes in his moral and emotional responses to the suffering of others, as he demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and vulnerability, while also displaying complete indifference to their pain and terror. The deaths he inflicted were neither sadistic nor merciful, but rather mechanical, the inevitable result of contact between a being who had transcended normal limitations and individuals who represented everything he had once been yet could never become again. The appropriation of clothing and equipment from his victims served practical purposes, while also functioning as a form of symbolic reclamation of human identity and social connection. Though the massive alterations required to make normal garments fit his enlarged form created grotesque parodies of conventional dress that emphasized his alienation from the human community, while also suggesting his desire to maintain some connection to the civilization that had shaped his Bamya original consciousness. The sight of his enormous frame clothed in the tattered remnants of his victims' possessions would become one of the most disturbing aspects of his appearance, speaking to the preservation of human vanity and social awareness within a form that had been fundamentally transformed through supernatural means. The journey from Slaughter Swamp toward the populated areas surrounding Gotham City represented Solomon Grundy's first systematic exploration of the changes that had occurred in the world during his decades of absence, as industrial expansion and urban development had altered the landscape in ways that made navigation difficult, while also providing him with evidence of humanity's continued capacity for environmental destruction and social inequality. The abandoned buildings and polluted waterways that marked the boundaries between wilderness and civilization spoke to patterns of exploitation and neglect that resonated with his own experiences of victimization and transformation. The homeless shelter, where Solomon Grundy first attempted to interact with human society, represented both his desire for connection and his profound alienation from the community that had shaped his original identity, as the desperate men and women who sought refuge there provided him with an audience for his first attempts at communication, while also serving as reminders of the powerlessness and vulnerability that had characterized his own early experiences of poverty and abandonment. The fear and confusion that his presence generated among these marginalized individuals reflected not only his intimidating physical appearance, but also their instinctive recognition of something fundamentally alien and dangerous in his nature. The fragments of language that Solomon Grundy managed to articulate during these early encounters were drawn from the nursery rhyme that had provided him with his new identity, yet they also carried emotional resonances and semantic associations that connected him to broader patterns of meaning and significance within human culture, while also revealing the profound limitations of his altered consciousness, processing and expressing complex thoughts and emotions. The simple phrases that he could manage to speak carried far more weight and implication than their surface simplicity might suggest, serving as windows into a mind that retained human intelligence while operating according to entirely different principles and priorities. The reaction of Gotham City's homeless population to Solomon Grundy's presence in their community created the first systematic documentation of his existence and capabilities, as their reports to social workers and law enforcement officials provided authorities with initial descriptions of his appearance and behavior, while also establishing patterns of witness testimony that would prove crucial for understanding the nature of the threat he represented to public safety. The consistency of these accounts, despite the obvious trauma and confusion of those who provided them, suggested that something unprecedented and genuinely dangerous had emerged from the city's most neglected and forgotten regions. The establishment of Slaughter Swamp as Solomon Grundy's primary territory and base of operations reflected both his instinctive connection to the location of his transformation and his strategic understanding that the area's reputation and environmental hazards would provide him with natural defenses against human intrusion, while also offering access to the supernatural energies that sustained his continued existence. The corruption that permeated every aspect of the swamp's ecosystem served as both sanctuary and source of power, providing him with a domain where his altered nature was not merely accepted, but actively supported by forces that transcended normal, biological, and physical limitations. The territorial behavior that Solomon Grundy displayed toward other creatures and occasional human visitors within his swamp domain reflected the complex combination of plant-like and animal characteristics that defined his transformed nature, as he demonstrated both the rooted attachment to specific geographical locations that characterized vegetative life and the active defense of territory that marked the behavior of apex predators. His presence altered the entire ecosystem of the swamp in ways that extended far beyond simple intimidation of other inhabitants, creating changes in vegetation patterns, water chemistry, and atmospheric conditions that reflected his unique role as both part of and master of this corrupted environment. The psychological adaptation to his transformed existence required Solomon Grundy to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding his relationship to the world, and his place within the broader patterns of existence that connected all living things, as his hybrid nature made him simultaneously part of the human community that had shaped his original consciousness and the natural world that had provided the raw materials for his reconstruction. The isolation that resulted from this dual alienation was profound and permanent, creating forms of loneliness that transcended normal human experience, while also opening possibilities for connection and communication that operated according to principles entirely foreign to conventional social interaction. The dreams and visions that filled Solomon Grundy's periods of rest were populated by fragments of Cyrus Gold's memories, combined with impressions and images drawn from the collective consciousness of all the victims whose remains had contributed to his formation, creating narrative experiences that blended personal history with archetypal patterns of crime and punishment, death and resurrection, corruption and potential redemption. These nocturnal experiences provided him with access to forms of knowledge and understanding that his conscious mind could not directly process or articulate, yet which influenced his behavior and decision-making in ways that suggested the operation of wisdom and insight that transcended his apparent intellectual limitations. The gradual development of Solomon Grundy's unique personality and behavioral patterns during his early period of conscious existence reflected the complex interplay between his retained human memories, his plant-based physiological characteristics, and the supernatural energies that animated his hybrid form, creating a consciousness that was simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizably derived from human origins, yet operating according to principles that defied conventional psychological analysis or moral evaluation. The creature that emerged from this process of self-discovery was neither entirely monster nor entirely victim, but rather something unprecedented that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the possibility of redemption for beings whose existence transcended normal categories of moral judgment. The phenomenon that would define Solomon Grundy's existence across the decades and centuries following his initial resurrection was not simply immortality in any conventional sense, but rather a cyclical pattern of death and rebirth that operated according to supernatural principles which ensured that each destruction of his physical form would be followed by eventual reconstitution in configurations that varied dramatically in terms of intelligence, moral orientation, and raw power. This endless cycle of termination and renewal represented both punishment and opportunity, condemning him to eternal existence, while also providing infinite possibilities for growth, change, and perhaps even redemption through the accumulated experience of countless incarnations. The first death that Solomon Grundy experienced after his initial awakening came not through violence or accident, but rather through the natural exhaustion of the supernatural energies that had animated his resurrected form, as the complex biochemical and metaphysical processes that sustained his hybrid existence required periodic renewal. Through reconnection with the corrupted ecosystem of Slaughter Swamp, his consciousness faded gradually, rather than ending abruptly, allowing him to observe and understand the process of dissolution that would become as familiar to him as breathing had once been during his human existence as Cyrus Gold. The return to the swamp waters that served as both grave and birthplace initiated a period of dormancy that lasted several months, during which his dispersed consciousness remained dimly aware of the reconstruction processes that were rebuilding his physical form, while also integrating new elements and influences that would alter his personality and capabilities in his next incarnation. The plant matter and mineral deposits that comprised his basic structure were supplemented by organic materials from creatures that had died within the swamp during his period of dormancy, creating hybrid combinations that would manifest as enhanced abilities or altered behavioral patterns when he next achieved conscious existence. The second incarnation of Solomon Grundy that emerged from this reconstruction process displayed significantly reduced intellectual capacity compared to his initial resurrection, yet compensated for this limitation through increased physical strength and durability that made him virtually unstoppable when motivated by simple emotions or direct commands. This version possessed only fragmentary memories of his previous existence and almost no recollection of his original human identity as Cyrus Gold, operating primarily through instinctive responses and learned behaviors that had been encoded within his supernatural matrix during his period of transformation. The violence and destruction that characterized this second incarnation were not motivated by the complex psychological drives that had shaped Cyrus Gold's criminal career, but rather emerged from more primitive impulses that reflected his plant-like nature and territorial instincts, combined with fragmentary memories of human conflict and aggression that he could not fully understand or control. His actions during this period established patterns of behavior that would be associated with the Solomon Grundy identity for decades to come, creating a reputation for mindless destructiveness that obscured the more sophisticated consciousness that had animated his initial resurrection. The heroes who first encountered this diminished version of Solomon Grundy recognized him as a significant threat to public safety, while also noting the obvious differences between his current behavior and the more calculated violence that had been reported during his initial emergence from Slaughter Swamp. The systematic documentation of these encounters provided valuable insights into his cyclical nature, while also establishing protocols for dealing with future incarnations that might display varying levels of intelligence and moral development. The third resurrection brought forth a Solomon Grundy, whose intellectual capabilities had been partially restored through unknown mechanisms that seemed to operate according to principles related to the accumulated experiences of his previous incarnations, as though each death and rebirth allowed his consciousness to integrate lessons and insights that had been gained through direct interaction with the world beyond the swamp. This version displayed rudimentary problem-solving abilities and could engage in simple communication, though his moral reasoning remained severely impaired by the corruption that had shaped his supernatural existence. The relationship between Solomon Grundy's various incarnations and the specific circumstances of his deaths revealed patterns that suggested his resurrection process was influenced by factors beyond simple supernatural automation, as violent destructions tended to produce more aggressive subsequent versions, while deaths that occurred through exhaustion or environmental factors often resulted in incarnations that displayed greater intellectual capacity or even occasional glimpses of moral awareness. The heroes and scientists who studied these patterns began to develop theories about the possibility of influencing his resurrection process to produce versions that might be capable of positive contributions to society. The incarnation that displayed the most remarkable deviation from Solomon Grundy's typical behavioral patterns emerged following a death that had occurred while he was attempting to protect a group of children from a collapsing building, an action that seemed entirely inconsistent with his previous record of violence and destruction, yet which apparently influenced his subsequent resurrection in ways that activated dormant aspects of Cyrus Gold's original personality that had been preserved within his supernatural matrix. This version demonstrated not only enhanced intelligence, but also genuine compassion and a desire to help others that lasted for several months before external circumstances triggered his return to more typical patterns of behavior. The heroic incarnation of Solomon Grundy proved capable of working alongside established heroes in situations that required his unique combination of strength and durability, though his appearance and reputation made public acceptance difficult, while his own internal conflicts between retained human values and supernatural impulses created ongoing psychological struggles that ultimately proved unsustainable. The tragedy of this brief period of heroism lay not in its failure, but in its demonstration that the potential for redemption existed within his corrupted consciousness, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to manifest itself through future resurrections. The scientific community's attempts to study Solomon Grundy's resurrection cycle were hampered by both the unpredictable nature of his deaths and the dangerous conditions surrounding his resurrection sites, though persistent researchers managed to collect enough data to develop preliminary theories about the mechanisms that governed his cyclical existence. The discovery that his consciousness appeared to be stored within the supernatural matrix that permeated Slaughter Swamp raised questions about the possibility of artificially triggering resurrections or influencing the characteristics of subsequent incarnations through environmental manipulation. The moral and ethical implications of Solomon Grundy's cyclical existence challenged conventional understanding of identity, responsibility, and the nature of punishment and redemption, as each incarnation seemed to represent a genuinely different individual. Despite sharing the same supernatural matrix and basic physical form, the question of whether each version could be held accountable for the actions of previous incarnations became a source of ongoing debate among philosophers, theologians, and legal scholars who struggled to develop frameworks for understanding beings whose existence transcended normal categories of individual identity. The most intellectually sophisticated incarnation of Solomon Grundy that emerged during his early decades of cyclical existence displayed not only enhanced reasoning abilities, but also access to memories and knowledge that seemed to extend beyond his personal experiences to encompass information drawn from the collective consciousness of all the victims whose remains had contributed to his original transformation. This version could discuss historical events he had never witnessed and demonstrate understanding of scientific principles that had been discovered after his human death, suggesting that his supernatural matrix provided him with access to forms of knowledge that transcended individual experience. The relationship between Solomon Grundy's various incarnations and the broader supernatural forces that governed his existence revealed itself through subtle patterns and influences that suggested his cyclical deaths and resurrections served purposes beyond simple perpetuation of his individual consciousness. Each incarnation seemed to fulfill specific roles within larger cosmic narratives that connected him to ancient conflicts between order and chaos, life and death, corruption and redemption that had been playing out across multiple dimensions and timelines for eons beyond human comprehension. The incarnations that displayed the most destructive capabilities often emerged during periods of environmental crisis or social upheaval, as though the supernatural forces that governed his existence were responding to broader patterns of conflict and instability that required the intervention of beings whose power transcended normal limitations. The timing of these resurrections suggested that Solomon Grundy's existence served functions within larger ecological and spiritual systems that used his unique combination of human consciousness and supernatural power to address imbalances that could not be corrected through conventional means. The psychological continuity that existed between Solomon Grundy's various incarnations was more complex than simple memory transfer, as each version seemed to inherit not only specific recollections, but also emotional associations and behavioral patterns that had been shaped by the accumulated experiences of all previous versions. This created a form of personality development that spanned multiple lifetimes, while also allowing for dramatic variations in temperament and moral orientation that reflected the specific circumstances of each resurrection. The incarnations that displayed the most human-like characteristics often struggled with profound existential questions about the nature of their existence and the purpose of their endless cycle of death and rebirth, experiencing forms of despair and confusion that were intensified by their awareness of their own supernatural nature and the impossibility of achieving normal human relationships or social integration. These periods of philosophical crisis sometimes led to self-destructive behaviors that hastened their deaths, while also influencing the characteristics of subsequent incarnations through the emotional states that dominated their final moments. The relationship between Solomon Grundy's physical form and his consciousness proved to be far more fluid than conventional understanding of mind-body relationships would suggest. As dramatic changes in his material composition during different incarnations were accompanied by corresponding alterations in his mental capabilities and personality traits. Incarnations that incorporated larger proportions of plant matter tended to display greater connection to natural forces and environmental awareness, while those that included more mineral components often demonstrated enhanced strength and durability at the cost of reduced intellectual flexibility. The heroes who encountered multiple incarnations of Solomon Grundy developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with his varying capabilities and behavioral patterns, learning to assess each version's particular characteristics and limitations before engaging in combat or attempting communication. The most successful of these encounters involved heroes who recognized the genuine person that existed within each incarnation despite the supernatural corruption that shaped his existence, treating him as a tragic figure worthy of compassion, rather than simply a monster to be defeated and contained. The incarnations that achieved the longest periods of stable existence were typically those that found some form of purpose or meaning that aligned with their particular combination of abilities and psychological characteristics, whether through heroic service, environmental protection, or even carefully controlled forms of vigilante justice that channeled their violent impulses toward genuinely deserving targets. These periods of stability often ended when external forces disrupted the delicate balance of circumstances that had allowed them to function effectively within human society. The scientific analysis of tissue samples and environmental data collected from Solomon Grundy's various incarnations revealed that his supernatural matrix was continuously evolving and adapting in response to changing conditions. Within Slaughter Swamp and the broader environment, incorporating new elements and influences that reflected everything from industrial pollution to cosmic radiation that affected the entire region. This constant adaptation ensured that no two incarnations were exactly identical, while also maintaining enough consistency to preserve his essential identity across multiple resurrections. The most tragic aspect of Solomon Grundy's cyclical existence was not the violence and destruction that characterized many of his incarnations, but rather the brief glimpses of genuine humanity and moral awareness that occasionally emerged from the corruption that defined his supernatural nature, providing tantalizing hints of what he might have become if different choices had been made during his original human existence, or if the forces that governed his resurrection could be influenced toward more positive outcomes. These moments of clarity and compassion served as reminders that even the most corrupted consciousness retained the potential for growth and redemption, though the specific circumstances required to activate and sustain such development remained elusive and unpredictable. The documentation of Solomon Grundy's various incarnations across the decades following his initial resurrection created an unprecedented record of supernatural existence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and moral responsibility, while also providing valuable insights into the relationship between spiritual corruption and environmental contamination that had broader implications for understanding similar phenomena that occurred in other locations throughout the world. The pattern of his cyclical existence became a subject of study that attracted researchers from multiple disciplines. Though the dangerous nature of direct observation limited the scope and accuracy of most investigative efforts, the legacy of Solomon Grundy's multiple incarnations extended beyond their individual actions and achievements to encompass the broader questions they raised about the nature of existence itself and the possibility of redemption for beings whose consciousness had been fundamentally altered through supernatural means, creating philosophical and theological debates that continued long after specific incarnations had been forgotten, while also establishing precedents for dealing with similar entities that might emerge from comparable circumstances in the future. The confrontations that would define Solomon Grundy's place within the pantheon of supernatural threats began not with his most famous encounters, but with a series of battles against Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern, whose connection to the mystical forces of nature made him uniquely suited to understand and combat the corrupted energies that animated the shambling giant who had emerged from Slaughter Swamp's cursed waters. Their first meeting occurred during one of Grundy's early rampages through the outskirts of Gotham City, when the emerald-powered hero responded to reports of a creature whose strength and apparent invulnerability exceeded anything in the existing files of known superhuman threats. The philosophical dimensions of the conflict between Green Lantern and Solomon Grundy extended far beyond simple heroic intervention to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between the forces of growth and decay, creation and destruction, natural harmony and supernatural corruption that had been embedded within the cosmic order since the beginning of existence itself. Alan Scott's ring drew its power from the green, the mystical force that connected all plant life throughout the universe, while Grundy represented a perversion of that same energy, channeled through corruption and violence, rather than growth and renewal. The tactical challenges that Grundy presented to Green Lantern were unlike anything the hero had previously encountered, as his supernatural resilience proved capable of withstanding direct energy attacks that should have been sufficient to incapacitate or destroy any conventional opponent, while his primitive intelligence made psychological warfare and strategic misdirection largely ineffective as methods of gaining advantage during their battles. The emerald constructs that had proven devastatingly effective against other enemies seemed to have minimal impact on a being whose very existence violated the natural laws that gave Green Lantern's power, its foundation, and meaning. The discovery that Grundy's strength actually increased when he was in proximity to sources of plant life or natural environments created additional complications for Green Lantern's efforts to contain him, as the hero's own power source seemed to provide sustenance and enhancement to his opponent, rather than weakness that could be exploited for strategic advantage. This paradoxical relationship between their respective energy sources forced Alan Scott to develop entirely new combat techniques and tactical approaches that minimized his reliance on direct applications of ring power while maximizing his brute use of intelligence, experience, and environmental factors that might prove more effective than raw force. The psychological impact of these early encounters with Solomon Grundy on Alan Scott's understanding of his heroic mission was profound and lasting, as they forced him to confront the reality that his power to protect and nurture life could be perverted and corrupted into instruments of destruction and chaos through supernatural means that operated beyond conventional moral frameworks. The existence of a being who embodied the dark mirror of everything the green represented challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil, while also revealing vulnerabilities in his own power source that he had never previously considered or prepared to address. The battles between Green Lantern and Solomon Grundy often took place in locations where the boundary between urban civilization and natural wilderness created unique environmental conditions that influenced both combatants in ways that reflected their respective connections to different aspects of the living world. The industrial pollution and environmental degradation that characterized many of these battlefields seemed to enhance Grundy's capabilities, while simultaneously weakening the natural forces that Alan Scott could draw upon for strength and inspiration, creating tactical situations that favored the corrupted giant while forcing the hero to rely more heavily on personal skill and determination than supernatural assistance. The eventual development of strategies that proved effective against Solomon Grundy required Green Lantern to accept that some threats could not be permanently eliminated through conventional heroic methods, but rather needed to be contained and managed through ongoing vigilance and intervention that acknowledged the cyclical nature of Grundy's existence, while also preparing for the variations in capability and behavior that characterized his different incarnations. This recognition represented a fundamental shift in Alan Scott's approach to heroism, from the expectation of decisive victory to acceptance of ongoing responsibility for managing threats that could never be completely resolved. The encounters between Superman and Solomon Grundy presented entirely different challenges and revealed different aspects of both characters' natures. As the last son of Krypton's extraordinary physical capabilities proved more evenly matched against Grundy's supernatural strength, while his moral certainty provided him with psychological resources that were less vulnerable to the existential confusion that the undead giant's existence had created for other heroes. Their first battle occurred during one of Grundy's more destructive incarnations, when his rampage through downtown Metropolis threatened thousands of innocent lives, while also causing structural damage that could have resulted in even greater casualties if not contained quickly and decisively. The philosophical complexity of Superman's relationship with Solomon Grundy was rooted in the hero's recognition that his opponent was not simply a monster to be defeated, but rather a tragic figure whose existence represented the ultimate consequences of choices made during a human lifetime that had been shaped by circumstances remarkably similar to those that might have corrupted any individual who lacked sufficient moral foundation and support from caring relationships. The knowledge that Grundy had once been Cyrus Gold, a man whose transformation from victim to victimizer paralleled patterns that Superman had observed in countless other individuals throughout his career, created emotional complications that made their conflicts more than simple applications of superior force against inferior opposition. The tactical aspects of combat between Superman and Solomon Grundy revealed the extent to which raw physical power could be offset by intelligence, experience, and moral clarity when applied with sufficient skill and determination, as the hero's ability to analyze his opponent's behavioral patterns and psychological limitations often proved more decisive than his advantages in speed, flight, and energy projection. The battles that proved most challenging were those in which Grundy's primitive intelligence was supplemented by external guidance from more sophisticated enemies, who understood how to direct his destructive capabilities toward specific targets while also exploiting his psychological vulnerabilities to maintain control over his actions. The emotional impact of these encounters on Superman was complicated by his recognition that Solomon Grundy's cyclical existence offered genuine possibilities for redemption and positive development that could never be realized, as long as external forces continued to exploit his condition for destructive purposes, creating moral obligations that extended beyond simple containment of immediate threats to encompass longer-term responsibilities for protecting a being whose suffering was as real as the danger he posed to others. The hero's consistent attempts to reach whatever humanity remained within Grundy's corrupted consciousness reflected both his fundamental optimism about the possibility of redemption and his understanding that even the most fallen individuals retained sparks of divine potential that could be nurtured under the right circumstances. The battles between Batman and Solomon Grundy took place primarily within Gotham City's boundaries and often involved the Dark Knight's superior tactical planning and technological resources being tested against an opponent whose supernatural capabilities made conventional detective work and criminal psychology largely irrelevant as tools for prediction and control. The world's greatest detective found himself confronting a mystery that could not be solved through logical deduction or scientific analysis, as Grundy's cyclical existence operated according to principles that transcended normal causality, while his varying incarnations displayed behavioral patterns that defied consistent psychological profiling. The strategic approaches that Batman developed for dealing with Solomon Grundy reflected his understanding that direct confrontation with a being of such immense physical power would inevitably result in defeat for any merely human opponent, requiring instead the use of environmental factors, technological assistance, and psychological manipulation to achieve objectives that could not be accomplished through conventional combat techniques. The success of these strategies often depended upon Batman's ability to predict which incarnation of Grundy he was facing and to adapt his methods accordingly, creating contingency plans for multiple variations while remaining flexible enough to respond to unexpected developments. The personal significance of Solomon Grundy's existence for Batman extended beyond professional obligation to encompass deeper questions about justice, redemption, and the relationship between past crimes and present identity that resonated with his own psychological development and moral philosophy. As the creature's cyclical deaths and resurrections created scenarios where traditional concepts of punishment and rehabilitation became meaningless, while also raising questions about whether individuals could ever truly escape the punishment consequences of their choices. The tragedy of Cyrus Gold's transformation into an immortal monster provided Batman with a cautionary tale about the ultimate destination of paths that began with justified anger but evolved into systematic vengeance and moral compromise. The collaboration between various heroes in confronting Solomon Grundy during his most dangerous incarnations demonstrated both the necessity of cooperative effort against supernatural threats and the unique challenges presented by opponents whose capabilities and behavior patterns varied dramatically between encounters, requiring flexible strategies that could accommodate multiple contingencies while also maintaining sufficient coordination to prevent the kind of tactical confusion that such powerful enemies could exploit for destructive advantage. The formation of temporary alliances between heroes who typically operated independently reflected their recognition that some threats transcended individual capabilities and jurisdictions. The connection between Solomon Grundy and the mystical forces known as the Green represented one of the most complex and potentially significant aspects of his supernatural existence, as his corrupted plant-based physiology linked him to cosmic energies that governed the relationship between all living things, while his spiritual corruption created distortions and imbalances that affected entire ecosystems and environmental systems far beyond the boundaries of slaughter. Swamp. The discovery that his presence could influence vegetation, growth, soil chemistry, and even weather patterns across significant geographical areas made him a subject of interest for both environmental scientists and mystical practitioners. who sought to understand the mechanisms by which consciousness could affect natural processes. The grey, the supernatural force that represented decay and death in opposition to the green's growth and life, seemed to have claimed Solomon Grundy as one of its primary agents within the physical world, using his cyclical existence to spread corruption and spiritual contamination throughout natural systems that had previously been protected by the harmonious balance between growth and decay that characterized healthy ecosystems. The battles between these opposing forces often manifested through Grundy's encounters with heroes and entities who drew their power from the green, creating conflicts that had implications extending far beyond individual combat to encompass the fundamental stability of life itself throughout entire regions. The environmental consequences of Solomon Grundy's various incarnations and their activities created long-term ecological impacts that persisted long after specific conflicts had been resolved, as the supernatural energies he channeled left residual contamination in soil, water, and atmospheric conditions that affected both plant and animal life in ways that conventional environmental science was ill-equipped to predict or remedy. The areas where his most destructive battles had taken place became subjects of ongoing study by researchers who sought to understand how supernatural forces could create permanent changes in natural systems while also developing methods for restoration and protection against similar contamination. In the future, the relationship between Solomon Grundy's consciousness and the broader network of plant life throughout the world created possibilities for communication and influence that operated according to principles entirely different from normal sensory perception or technological transmission, as his hybrid nature allowed him to access information and awareness that transcended individual perspective, while also making him vulnerable to psychic attacks and manipulation by entities who understood how to exploit these connections for strategic advantage. The heroes and scientists who studied these phenomena discovered that his apparent simplicity concealed access to forms of knowledge and capability that could be extraordinarily dangerous when properly directed. The role that Solomon Grundy played within various criminal organizations and temporary alliances reflected both the potential value of his immense physical capabilities and the significant risks associated with attempting to control or direct a being whose psychological stability and loyalty were subject to dramatic changes without warning or apparent cause. The villains who sought to use him as a weapon or enforcer discovered that his cyclical nature made him an unreliable ally whose behavior could shift from mindless obedience to destructive independence based on factors that remained largely unpredictable. Despite extensive observation and analysis, the encounters between Solomon Grundy and other supernatural entities revealed the extent to which his existence had become integrated into cosmic conflicts and mystical hierarchies that operated beyond normal human understanding, as various forces of order and chaos, good and evil, growth and decay sought to influence his development and channel his power toward their own objectives, while also protecting themselves from the corruption that his presence could spread to other supernatural beings who lacked sufficient spiritual protection or moral foundation to resist his influence. These interactions often resulted in temporary alterations to his capabilities and behavior that reflected the specific nature of the entities involved, while also contributing to the unpredictable variations that characterized his different incarnations. The legacy of Solomon Grundy's battles with heroes throughout the decades of his cyclical existence created a comprehensive record of supernatural combat that provided invaluable insights into the capabilities and limitations of beings whose power transcended normal physical laws, while also establishing precedents and protocols for dealing with similar entities that might emerge from comparable circumstances in the future. The strategies and techniques that proved most effective against him became standard elements of heroic training programs, while also contributing to the development of technologies and methodologies that enhanced humanity's ability to defend itself against threats that operated beyond conventional understanding of conflict and warfare. The profound loneliness that defined Solomon Grundy's existence across his countless incarnations was not merely the isolation of a monster feared and rejected by human society, but rather the far more devastating alienation of a consciousness that retained fragments of human emotion and need, while being trapped within a form and circumstances that made genuine connection virtually impossible to achieve or sustain. The tragedy of his condition lay not in his physical appearance or supernatural abilities, but in the preservation of enough humanity within his corrupted essence to understand what he had lost, while lacking the capacity to reclaim or replace it through any means available to his transformed nature. The friendship that developed between Solomon Grundy and Bizarro during one of his more intellectually capable incarnations represented perhaps the most poignant example of connection between beings who existed on the margins of normal society, two creatures whose origins in corruption and artificial creation had left them seeking forms of acceptance and understanding that their respective natures made extraordinarily difficult to find or maintain. Their initial encounter occurred during a period when both were wandering the outskirts of major cities, drawn by instinctive desires for human contact while also being driven away by the fear and hostility that their appearances inevitably generated among the populations they sought to join. The simplicity that characterized both Solomon Grundy's and Bizarro's approaches to social interaction created a foundation for mutual understanding that transcended the complex psychological barriers and moral judgments that typically prevented such outcasts from forming meaningful relationships with others, as their respective limitations and childlike perspectives allowed them to see past external differences, to recognize shared experiences of rejection, confusion, and desperate longing for acceptance that created bonds deeper than those based on mere similarity of interests or backgrounds. The activities that Solomon Grundy and Bizarro shared during their brief period of companionship were marked by the kind of innocent joy and spontaneous affection that had been absent from both their existences since their respective transformations from their original forms, as they discovered that their combined presence could create moments of genuine happiness that neither could achieve alone, despite their individual struggles to find meaning and purpose within their cursed existences. Their games and adventures, though often misunderstood by observers as destructive or threatening, were actually expressions of the most positive aspects of their retained humanity, attempts to recreate the kinds of play and exploration that had been denied to them through their tragic origins. The communication between these two damaged beings operated according to principles that bypassed normal linguistic complexity to focus on emotional resonance and shared understanding of experiences that could not be adequately expressed through conventional language, creating a form of communion that was more authentic and meaningful than many relationships between beings whose social capabilities were far more sophisticated, but whose emotional connections were limited by pretense, manipulation, or simple lack of genuine empathy for others' suffering and isolation. The protection that each provided for the other during their time together revealed aspects of their characters that were rarely visible during their individual struggles with a world that viewed them primarily as threats to be contained or destroyed, as their mutual loyalty and concern demonstrated that even the most corrupted consciousness could retain the capacity for selfless care and genuine affection when given appropriate opportunities and recipients worthy of such investment. Their willingness to risk their own safety for each other's welfare provided evidence that redemption remained possible, even for beings whose existences had been shaped by supernatural corruption and systematic rejection. The eventual separation that ended their friendship was not the result of betrayal or growing incompatibility, but rather the inevitable consequence of external forces that viewed their alliance as particularly dangerous due to the combined threat their cooperation might pose to established order and social stability, creating circumstances that forced them apart. Despite their mutual desire to maintain the relationship that had provided, both with their first genuine experience of acceptance and unconditional positive regard from another conscious being, the relationship between Solomon Grundy and Poison Ivy during several of his more environmentally connected incarnations demonstrated different aspects of his capacity for emotional attachment, while also revealing the complex interplay between his plant-based physiology and his retained human psychology in creating bonds that transcended normal categories of romantic love, friendship, or simple alliance. Ivy's own hybrid nature and her connection to the green created natural affinity with Grundy's corrupted but still fundamentally plant-derived existence, allowing her to perceive and appreciate aspects of his character that remained invisible to purely human observers. The protection that Solomon Grundy consistently offered to Poison Ivy during their various encounters reflected not only his instinctive response to her plant-based nature, but also genuine affection for someone whose own transformation and rejection by human society had created experiences and perspectives that resonated with his own struggles to find meaning and purpose within existence that operated according to rules entirely different from normal human life. His willingness to place himself in danger for her sake demonstrated that his capacity for love had survived his supernatural transformation, though it expressed itself through actions rather than words, due to the limitations that corruption had imposed upon his ability to articulate complex emotions. The tenderness that occasionally appeared in Solomon Grundy's interactions with Poison Ivy was all the more remarkable for its contrast with the violence and destruction that characterized most of his activities, revealing that beneath the accumulated trauma and spiritual corruption that defined his existence lay traces of the gentleness and care that had once characterized Cyrus Gold during his brief moments of genuine human connection. These glimpses of authentic emotion provided both participants with experiences of vulnerability and intimacy that their respective natures made extremely rare and precious, despite the inherent instability and limitations that prevented such connections from developing into lasting relationships. The scientific fascination that Poison Ivy felt towards Solomon Grundy's unique biological and supernatural characteristics was balanced by genuine emotional attachment that transcended mere intellectual curiosity, as she recognized in him a kindred spirit whose transformation had been as profound and isolating as her own, while also possessing qualities of endurance and resilience that she found both admirable and heartbreaking. Her attempts to understand and potentially enhance his condition were motivated as much by affection and desire to reduce his suffering as by scientific interest in the mechanisms that governed his cyclical existence. The tragic aspect of their relationship lay not in its eventual termination, but in its demonstration that even the most damaged and corrupted beings could find moments of genuine connection and mutual care that transcended their individual limitations, while also highlighting the broader isolation and rejection that made such connections so rare and precious when they did occur. The love that existed between them, however briefly and incompletely expressed, provided evidence that consciousness itself contained resources for growth and healing that could survive even the most devastating trauma and transformation. The incarnations of Solomon Grundy that displayed heroic qualities and genuine desire to protect innocent life represented the most complex and philosophically challenging aspects of his cyclical existence, as they raised fundamental questions about identity, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption for beings whose consciousness had been shaped by supernatural corruption, while also retaining essential elements of human nature that could be activated under appropriate circumstances. These heroic versions were not merely aberrations or anomalies, but rather expressions of potential that existed within his supernatural matrix, waiting for the right combination of influences to manifest itself through resurrection processes that incorporated positive rather than negative elements. The internal struggles that characterized Solomon Grundy's heroic incarnations were perhaps more intense and painful than those experienced by his more destructive versions, as enhanced intellectual capacity and moral awareness made him fully conscious of the horror and tragedy of his existence, while also creating impossible conflicts between his desire to help others and his recognition that his very presence brought danger and corruption to everything he sought to protect. The psychological torment of knowing that his best intentions could result in devastating consequences for those he cared about created forms of suffering that transcended normal human experience of guilt and self-doubt. The acceptance that these heroic incarnations occasionally received from other heroes and from members of the public who recognized their genuine desire to serve and protect provided them with tastes of the belonging and purpose that had been absent from their existence since their transformation from human to supernatural being, yet also intensified their awareness of what they had lost and could never fully reclaim due to the fundamental nature of their corrupted existence. The temporary nature of such acceptance, whether due to their eventual death and resurrection, or to growing fear and suspicion from those they sought to help, created cycles of hope and disappointment that added additional layers of tragedy to their already complex psychological condition. The heroic actions performed by these incarnations often required them to overcome not only external obstacles, but also their own nature and history, as they struggled to channel their immense power toward constructive rather than destructive purposes, while also battling against the corruption and violent impulses that had been embedded within their consciousness through decades of supernatural existence. Their successes in these efforts provided evidence that even the most fundamental aspects of character and moral orientation could be altered through conscious choice and external support, though the fragility of such transformations also demonstrated the ongoing need for vigilance and care in nurturing positive development. The relationships that heroic incarnations of Solomon Grundy formed with established heroes revealed both the possibility of genuine partnership between beings of vastly different origins and natures, and the practical challenges involved in integrating someone whose existence operated according to supernatural principles into teams and organizations that had been designed around normal human capabilities and psychological patterns. The heroes who proved most successful in working with him were those who could see past his appearance and history, to recognize the genuine person struggling to emerge from the corruption that had shaped his existence. The search for his lost soul that motivated many of Solomon Grundy's actions across his various incarnations represented both literal quest for spiritual redemption and metaphorical expression of his desire to reclaim the essential humanity that had been systematically destroyed through his transformation from Cyrus Gold into something that existed beyond normal categories of life and death. This search took many forms, from simple expressions of longing and confusion to elaborate schemes and adventures designed to recover or replace whatever divine spark had been lost during his original corruption and supernatural resurrection. The encounters with mystical and supernatural entities that claimed knowledge of Solomon Grundy's spiritual condition often provided him with false hope or misleading information that led to additional suffering and disappointment, as beings who sought to exploit his desperation offered promises of redemption that they had no intention or ability to fulfill, while also using his power and influence for their own purposes. The pattern of betrayal and manipulation that characterized many of these interactions reinforced his isolation, while also deepening his confusion about the nature of his existence and the possibilities that might remain for genuine spiritual healing and restoration. The moments of genuine spiritual insight and peace that occasionally broke through Solomon Grundy's normal existence of confusion and torment were all the more precious for their rarity and brevity, providing him with glimpses of what his existence might become if the corruption that defined his nature could be overcome or transcended through appropriate intervention and support. These experiences, whether they came through meditation, prayer, acts of service, or simple human connection, suggested that his soul had not been entirely destroyed, but rather remained hidden beneath layers of supernatural contamination that could potentially be cleansed under the right circumstances. The philosophical implications of Solomon Grundy's search for spiritual redemption extended beyond his individual case to encompass broader questions about the nature of the soul, the possibility of genuine transformation for beings who had committed terrible crimes, and the relationship between consciousness and moral identity that challenged conventional understanding of justice, punishment, and the potential for growth and change. His existence served as a test case for theories about whether any being, regardless of the extent of their corruption or the magnitude of their crimes, retained the essential capacity for redemption that made continued existence meaningful rather than simply prolonged punishment. The impact that Solomon Grundy's brief moments of heroism and genuine connection had upon the heroes and civilians who witnessed them was profound and lasting, as these encounters forced observers to confront their own assumptions about the nature of evil and the possibility of redemption, while also providing them with evidence that hope and compassion could survive even the most devastating circumstances and transformations. The memory of his temporary nobility and selflessness served as inspiration for continued efforts to reach and potentially heal other beings whose existence seemed to place them beyond the reach of normal human sympathy and understanding. The cyclical nature of Solomon Grundy's existence meant that each death and resurrection offered new opportunities for spiritual growth and moral development, though the specific factors that determined whether any given incarnation would display positive or negative characteristics remained largely mysterious despite extensive observation and analysis by heroes, scientists, and mystical practitioners who sought to understand and influence his transformation process. The unpredictability of his resurrection served both as source of hope for those who believed in his potential for redemption, and as ongoing concern for those who recognized the threat that his more destructive incarnations posed to public safety and social order. The legacy of Solomon Grundy's moments of humanity and heroism extended beyond their immediate impact to create lasting changes in how heroes and society approached other beings whose existence challenged conventional categories of good and evil, monster and victim, criminal and innocent. The precedent established by his capacity for positive transformation, however temporary and incomplete, provided foundation for more compassionate and nuanced responses to similar entities, while also demonstrating that patience, understanding, and genuine care could sometimes achieve what force and punishment could never accomplish in addressing the root causes of supernatural corruption and moral confusion. The cataclysmic events known as Flashpoint fundamentally altered the structure of reality itself, reshaping the timelines and histories that had governed existence for millennia, while also providing Solomon Grundy with an entirely new origin story that maintained his essential nature while dramatically changing the circumstances and relationships that had originally led to his transformation. From human being into supernatural monster, the revised history that emerged from these cosmic upheavals presented a version of events that was both simpler and more tragic than his previous incarnation, stripping away layers of criminal complexity to focus on the more fundamental human themes of love, betrayal, and the desperate choices that ordinary people make when faced with impossible circumstances. The 1898 that served as the temporal setting for this reconstructed origin placed Solomon Grundy's transformation within a historical context that emphasized the harsh realities of rural poverty and social powerlessness that had characterized life for countless families. Throughout America's agricultural regions during the late 19th century, when economic forces beyond individual control could destroy entire communities while offering their inhabitants few alternatives beyond submission to exploitation or desperate rebellion against systems that seemed designed to perpetuate their suffering across multiple generations. The humble cabin in Slaughter Swamp that housed Solomon Grundy and his small family represented both sanctuary and prison, providing them with basic shelter and independence from the social structures that had failed them, while also isolating them from the support networks and opportunities that might have offered alternatives to their increasingly desperate circumstances. The swamp itself, even before its supernatural corruption, was a marginal environment that demanded constant vigilance and hard work to provide even minimal sustenance, making survival a daily struggle that left little energy for hope or planning beyond immediate necessities. The wife named Penny, who shared Solomon Grundy's harsh existence, brought her own history of hardship and compromise to their relationship, her presence serving as both motivation for his efforts to create a better life and reminder of the vulnerability that poverty imposed upon those who lacked the resources or connections necessary to protect themselves from exploitation by more powerful individuals who viewed their desperation as opportunity for personal advantage. Her love for him was genuine and deep, yet it existed within circumstances that would ultimately corrupt and destroy it through forces that neither of them possessed the power to control or resist. The child who completed their small family unit represented hope for a future that might transcend the limitations and suffering that had defined their own lives, yet also served as additional pressure and responsibility that intensified the desperation driving Solomon's increasingly dangerous choices as he sought to provide security and opportunities that remained perpetually beyond his reach. Despite his willingness to sacrifice everything, including his moral principles, and ultimately his life, in pursuit of goals that the economic and social systems of his era made virtually impossible for people of his class and circumstances to achieve. The crop failures that devastated their small farm and threatened their survival were not merely natural disasters, but rather the predictable consequences of environmental degradation and unsustainable agricultural practices that had been imposed upon the land by previous generations of settlers, who had prioritized short-term profit over long-term ecological health, creating conditions that made subsistence farming increasingly difficult, while also limiting the options available to families who lacked the resources necessary to adapt to changing conditions or relocate to more promising regions. The boss named Henry Pittance, who controlled their economic fate, embodied the worst aspects of the exploitative relationships that characterized much of rural American society during this period. Using his position of relative power and influence to extract sexual favors from desperate women, while also maintaining the fiction that such arrangements were voluntary transactions rather than forms of rape and extortion that took advantage of poverty and powerlessness to satisfy personal desires, at the cost of destroying families and communities that had no effective means of resistance or appeal. The terrible choice that Penny faced between allowing her family to starve and submitting to Pittance's sexual demands represented the kind of impossible moral dilemma that economic desperation created for countless individuals throughout history, forcing them to choose between different forms of destruction, while also ensuring that whatever decision they made would result in profound psychological damage and spiritual corruption that could never be fully healed or overcome through any subsequent actions or circumstances. The psychological impact on Solomon of being forced to witness his wife's sexual degradation, while remaining powerless to prevent or stop it, created forms of rage and humiliation that transcended normal human capacity for processing. Trauma, as his love for Penny and his role as her protector, was systematically destroyed by circumstances that reduced him to helpless observer of her suffering, while also making him complicit in her victimization through his inability to provide alternative means of survival for their family. The tragic decision that Penny ultimately made to end her own life, rather than continue enduring the sexual exploitation that had become necessary for their survival, represented both ultimate expression of despair and final act of agency, choosing death as the only form of freedom available to someone whose circumstances had systematically eliminated every other possibility for escape from unbearable degradation and suffering that showed no signs of ending or improving. Through any means available to her limited resources and options, the violence that followed Penny's suicide was not merely emotional explosion, but rather carefully planned campaign of revenge that demonstrated how completely Solomon's moral framework had been shattered by the destruction of everything he had valued and sought to protect, as his systematic murder of Henry Pittance and the other men who had participated in or enabled his wife's exploitation served both practical and symbolic functions in his psychological response to trauma that exceeded his capacity for rational processing or healthy resolution. The method by which Solomon ended his own life, stabbing himself in the stomach before sinking into the swamp waters that would ultimately transform him into something supernatural and terrible, represented both rejection of continued existence under conditions that had proven unbearable and unconscious recognition that the corruption which had consumed his humanity required forms of punishment and purification that transcended normal categories of justice or moral accountability. The connection between Solomon Grundy's resurrection and Alan Scott's selection as the Green Lantern revealed the extent to which cosmic forces had become involved in the supernatural processes that governed his cyclical existence, as the mystical energies that empowered the emerald-wielding hero also triggered the awakening of something that had been dormant within the swamp's cursed ecosystem for decades, while also establishing patterns of conflict and opposition that would define their relationship across multiple incarnations and encounters. The environmental devastation that preceded and accompanied Solomon Grundy's awakening in this revised timeline operated on scales that exceeded anything associated with his previous incarnations, as his connection to the grey enabled him to spread decay and corruption across vast geographical areas, while also demonstrating the extent to which his transformed nature had become integrated with forces that transcended individual consciousness to encompass entire ecosystems and environmental camps, systems that could be influenced and altered through supernatural means. The global scope of the destruction that Grundy's stirring created, affecting structures and natural features as distant as Poland while he remained physically located in North America, revealed the extent to which his existence had become connected to planetary and cosmic forces that operated according to principles entirely different from normal causality or geographical limitation, making him a threat that could not be contained through conventional methods, while also suggesting that his ultimate purpose involved functions and responsibilities that transcended individual identity or personal history. The strategic targeting of significant governmental and cultural landmarks such as the Washington Monument, the White House, and the United States Capitol demonstrated that even in his dormant state, Solomon Grundy retained sufficient intelligence and awareness to plan and execute complex operations designed to attract the attention of specific individuals, while also serving symbolic functions that connected his personal tragedy to broader patterns of corruption and decay that had infected American society at its highest levels of power and authority. The heroes who responded to this unprecedented threat discovered that conventional approaches to supernatural containment and combat were inadequate against an enemy whose power seemed to increase rather than diminish when opposed by conventional force, requiring new forms of cooperation and sacrifice that tested the limits of their individual capabilities, while also forcing them to confront questions about the nature of heroism and the responsibilities that came with extraordinary power in the face of cosmic-level threats. The involvement of Jay Garrick, Hawkgirl, and Al Pratt in the initial attempts to contain Solomon Grundy's rampage revealed both the necessity of coordinated heroic response to threats of such magnitude and the individual vulnerabilities that even the most powerful heroes possessed when confronting opponents whose capabilities operated according to supernatural rather than merely superhuman principles, as their normal advantages of speed, flight, and size manipulation proved insufficient to overcome the fundamental corruption that animated their enormous opponent. The sacrifice that Alan Scott was forced to make, abandoning his physical form to establish connection with the Earth's interior matrix where the Grey resided, demonstrated the extent to which heroic service sometimes required accepting losses and transformations that fundamentally altered the hero's nature and capabilities, while also revealing the cosmic scope of the forces involved in conflicts that began with individual tragedy yet expanded to encompass universal principles of growth and decay, order and chaos. The temptation that the Grey offered to Alan Scott, promising reunion with his deceased lover Sam in exchange for cooperation with its agenda of universal corruption and entropy, revealed the sophisticated psychological warfare capabilities that cosmic forces possessed, while also demonstrating how personal loss and emotional vulnerability could be exploited by entities whose understanding of consciousness and motivation transcended normal limitations of empathy or moral consideration. The banishment of Solomon Grundy to the lunar surface represented both temporary victory and recognition of the fundamental impossibility of permanently defeating or containing forces that operated according to principles beyond normal spatial and temporal limitations, as his exile to Earth's satellite provided breathing space for recovery and preparation, while also acknowledging that his eventual return was inevitable, given the cyclical nature of his existence and the cosmic forces that sustained his supernatural matrix. The defeat of the remaining heroes during Alan Scott's absence and temptation revealed both the essential role that the Green Lantern played in coordinating resistance to supernatural threats and the vulnerability of heroic organizations that depended too heavily upon individual power, rather than developing systematic approaches to cosmic-level challenges that required sustained cooperation and mutual support across extended periods of conflict and preparation. The modern interpretations of Solomon Grundy's character across various media platforms reflected both the enduring appeal of his tragic story and the adaptability of his basic concept to different narrative contexts and thematic emphases as writers, artists, and producers found ways to explore his essential nature while also updating his circumstances and relationships to address contemporary concerns about environmental destruction, social inequality, and the psychological costs of violence and trauma. The animated appearances that brought Solomon Grundy to wider audiences through television series and digital platforms demonstrated the visual and emotional impact that his character could achieve when presented through media that emphasized spectacle and action, while also providing opportunities for more nuanced character development and moral complexity that revealed the human tragedy underlying his monstrous appearance and destructive capabilities. The video game representations that allowed players to interact directly with Solomon Grundy as both opponent and ally provided unique insights into his character, while also exploring the moral ambiguities and strategic challenges that his both opponent existence created for heroes and villains alike, as his unpredictable nature and immense power made him equally valuable and dangerous as partner or enemy, depending upon the specific incarnation and circumstances that governed any particular encounter. The continued evolution of Solomon Grundy's character across different creative teams and editorial directions reflected both the rich, thematic potential embedded within his origin story and the ongoing relevance of the questions about identity, redemption, and the nature of consciousness that his existence raised for audiences who were themselves grappling with rapid technological and social changes that challenged traditional assumptions about the relationship between individual identity and collective responsibility. The legacy of Solomon Grundy within popular culture extended beyond his specific appearances and storylines to encompass broader influence on how supernatural characters and themes were presented and explored within comic books and related media, as his combination of tragic origin, moral complexity, and genuine menace provided a template for creating characters whose existence challenged simple categories of heroism and villainy, while also addressing universal themes of loss, corruption, and the possibility of redemption that resonated across cultural and generational boundaries. In the endless cycle of death and resurrection that defines Solomon Grundy's eternal existence, we find reflected the fundamental truth that consciousness itself is both precious and fragile, capable of surviving the most devastating transformations, while also being vulnerable to corruption that can persist across multiple lifetimes and countless opportunities for redemption. His story serves as a mirror in which we may glimpse our own capacity for both transcendence and degradation, our ability to choose between the forces of creation and destruction that wage their eternal war within every human heart. The tragedy of Cyrus Gold's transformation into Solomon Grundy reminds us that evil is rarely chosen consciously, but rather emerges from the accumulation of small compromises and moral failures that gradually erode the foundations of character and purpose, creating conditions where supernatural corruption can take root and flourish in souls that might have chosen different paths if they had possessed sufficient wisdom support, and genuine hope for redemption through legitimate means. Yet within the shambling giant's endless quest for peace and understanding, we also discover evidence that even the most corrupted consciousness retains sparks of divine potential that can be nurtured and awakened through patience, compassion, and the recognition that every being deserves the opportunity to grow beyond their worst moments and most destructive choices. Rest now, guardian of dreams, and let these tales of shadow and light remind you that redemption remains possible, even in the darkest corners of existence.